The Ben Franklin Effect. The Ben Franklin Effect is one of the strangest and most unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals a hidden flaw in the way people believe emotions work. Most individuals assume that when someone likes you, they become more willing to help you. However, this effect suggests that the reverse can happen as well. A person may begin to like you simply because they have already done something for you. The phenomenon is named after Benjamin Franklin, who reportedly transformed a political rival into an ally by asking to borrow a rare book. The request was small, harmless, and easy to fulfill. After the rival agreed, and Franklin returned the book with appreciation, the relationship changed. The man who once viewed him negatively became noticeably warmer and friendlier. What makes this story fascinating is that the favor itself may have altered the rival's feelings. The reason lies in a psychological process known as cognitive dissonance. Human beings dislike contradictions between their actions and beliefs. When someone voluntarily helps another person, their subconscious mind searches for a reason to justify that behavior. If they previously disliked the person, an uncomfortable conflict appears. To remove that tension, the brain often changes its attitude rather than questioning the action. It quietly concludes that the person must be deserving of kindness. This creates a deeply intriguing reality. Every favor, no matter how small, can become a psychological investment. A borrowed pen, a piece of advice, or a few minutes of assistance may slowly increase emotional attachment. The more effort someone contributes, the more likely they are to value the person receiving it. What makes the Ben Franklin effect feel almost eerie is that people rarely notice it happening. They believe their growing affection is genuine and spontaneous, never realizing that their own actions may have quietly rewritten their emotions behind the scenes. The Prattfall Effect. The Prattfall Effect is one of the most fascinating psychological phenomena because it suggests that making a mistake can sometimes make a person more attractive, likable, or relatable. Most people spend enormous amounts of energy trying to appear flawless. They carefully manage their image, hide their weaknesses, and avoid embarrassment at all costs. Yet this effect reveals a surprising truth. Under the right circumstances, a small imperfection can actually increase someone's appeal. The term originated from psychological research showing that highly competent people often become more likable after committing a minor mistake. Imagine a respected expert giving an impressive presentation, answering every question correctly, and appearing completely confident. If that same person accidentally spills coffee on their shirt or stumbles over a simple word, many observers suddenly feel more connected to them. The mistake makes them seem human rather than untouchable. The reason this happens lies deep within human emotions. People naturally compare themselves to others. When someone appears perfect, admiration may be mixed with intimidation, envy, or distance. Perfection can create an invisible barrier that makes genuine connection difficult. A small flaw breaks that barrier. It reminds others that beneath the success, confidence, or status is an ordinary human being with vulnerabilities just like everyone else. What makes the Prattfall Effect particularly intriguing is its emotional power. A single, awkward moment can completely change how a person is perceived. Instead of weakening their image, it can make them appear warmer, more authentic, and easier to trust. The mistake becomes evidence that they are real. There is also a darker side to this phenomenon. Some individuals deliberately reveal carefully chosen flaws to appear more relatable and gain trust. The unsettling reality is that what looks like an accidental imperfection may sometimes be a calculated social strategy. Because of this, people often find themselves feeling closer to someone without realizing that a simple mistake may have played a powerful role in shaping that connection. The Illusory Truth Effect. The Illusory Truth Effect is one of the most disturbing psychological phenomena because it reveals how easily the human mind can mistake familiarity for truth. Most people believe they evaluate information logically, carefully separating facts from falsehoods. Yet this effect suggests that simply hearing something repeatedly can make it feel true, even when there is little or no evidence supporting it. At its core, the Illusory Truth Effect occurs when repeated statements become more believable over time. The first time you hear a claim, you may question it. The second time, it feels a little more familiar. After hearing it again and again, your brain begins to process it more easily. That ease creates a dangerous illusion. Instead of recognizing the statement as merely familiar, the mind starts interpreting that familiarity as proof that the statement must be accurate. The reason this happens lies in the way the brain conserves mental energy. Processing familiar information requires less effort than processing something new. As a result, repeated messages create a sense of comfort and cognitive fluency. Unfortunately, the brain often confuses that comfortable feeling with credibility. The statement feels true because it feels easy to think about. What makes this phenomenon especially unsettling is that it operates beneath conscious awareness. People often have no idea that repetition is influencing their beliefs. A rumor repeated often enough can begin to sound like a fact. A false accusation can gain credibility through sheer exposure. Even ideas that were initially rejected may slowly become accepted after enough repetition. The emotional power of the illusory truth effect explains why propaganda, misinformation, and manipulation can be so effective. Repetition quietly lowers resistance, making familiar messages feel increasingly trustworthy. The truly eerie part is that people often believe they arrived at their conclusions independently, never realizing that their confidence may have been shaped not by evidence, but by the simple act of hearing the same message over and over until it felt impossible to doubt. The sleeper effect. The sleeper effect is one of the most unsettling psychological phenomena because it shows that information can influence your beliefs long after you have forgotten why you were supposed to distrust it. Most people assume they can easily reject bad advice, misleading claims, or information from an unreliable source. However, the sleeper effect suggests that even when a message is initially dismissed, it can quietly return later and become surprisingly persuasive. The phenomenon occurs when people receive information from a source they know is questionable, biased, or untrustworthy. At first, they may reject the message because they remember where it came from. The warning label attached to the information protects them from accepting it. But as time passes, something strange begins to happen. The content of the message remains in memory, while the details about the unreliable source gradually fade away. This creates a dangerous psychological separation. The brain remembers the claim, but forgets the reason it was considered suspicious in the first place. As a result, the message may start to feel more reasonable, more familiar, and ultimately more believable. What was once dismissed can slowly become accepted without the person realizing the shift has occurred. The reason this effect is so powerful lies in the way memory works. Human memory does not store every detail equally. Facts, stories, and emotional impressions often remain longer than information about where they originated. Over time, the message survives while the credibility warning attached to it weakens. What makes the sleeper effect particularly eerie is that it operates silently. A person may genuinely believe they reached a conclusion through careful thinking, unaware that the idea was planted long ago by a source they once distrusted. This effect helps explain why misinformation, propaganda, and deceptive persuasion can have lasting influence. The truly unsettling reality is that a message you rejected today may continue working in the background of your mind, waiting for the moment when the source is forgotten, but the idea remains. The halo effect. The halo effect is one of the most powerful psychological biases because it reveals how a single positive trait can completely distort the way we see another person. Most people believe they judge others fairly, carefully evaluating different qualities one by one. In reality, the human mind often takes a shortcut. When it notices one impressive characteristic, it unconsciously assumes that many other positive qualities must also be present. The phenomenon gets its name from the idea of a glowing halo surrounding someone. Once a person creates a favorable first impression, that positive image spreads into other areas of perception. A physically attractive person may automatically be seen as more intelligent, trustworthy, capable, or kind. A confident speaker may be assumed to possess greater expertise than they actually do. A successful individual may appear more honest simply because of their achievements. The reason this effect occurs lies in the brain's desire for efficiency. Evaluating every aspect of a person requires time and mental effort. Instead, the mind often forms a general impression and allows that impression to influence future judgments. This process happens so quickly that people rarely notice it. They believe they are making objective decisions when they are actually being guided by an unconscious bias. What makes the halo effect particularly unsettling is how easily it can shape important life outcomes. Hiring decisions, friendships, romantic relationships, and even courtroom judgments can be influenced by it. A person with one highly visible strength may receive opportunities, trust, and admiration that have little to do with their actual character. There is also a darker side to this phenomenon. Manipulative individuals understand that creating one strong positive impression can cause others to overlook flaws, warning signs, or harmful behavior. People may continue trusting someone despite evidence that should raise concern. The truly eerie aspect of the halo effect is that it makes people feel certain they are seeing reality clearly. In truth, they may be responding not to who someone really is, but to the glow of a single trait that has quietly influenced everything else they believe about that person. The Horn Effect. The Horn Effect is one of the most unsettling psychological biases because it reveals how a single negative impression can completely reshape the way we see another person. While most people like to believe they evaluate others fairly and objectively, the reality is often very different. Once the mind identifies one flaw, mistake, or undesirable trait, it can begin viewing everything else about that person through a darker lens. The phenomenon is essentially the opposite of the halo effect. Instead of one positive characteristic creating favorable assumptions, one negative characteristic creates unfavorable ones. A person who appears rude during a first meeting may immediately be judged as selfish, dishonest, or incompetent. Someone who makes a simple mistake at work may suddenly seem less intelligent than they actually are. Even a minor social misstep can trigger a chain reaction of negative assumptions that extend far beyond the original event. The reason this happens lies in the brain's tendency to simplify complex social judgments. Forming detailed opinions about people requires time and mental effort. To save energy, the mind often creates a broad impression and uses it as a shortcut for future evaluations. Once a negative impression takes hold, the brain begins searching for information that confirms it while overlooking evidence that contradicts it. What makes the Horn effect particularly disturbing is how quickly it can influence important decisions. Friendships, careers, relationships, and reputations can all be affected by a single moment that creates a poor first impression. People may find themselves trapped by labels they never deserved, judged more by one visible flaw than by the full reality of who they are. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals sometimes exploit it by drawing attention to a target's weakness or mistake, knowing that others may begin viewing everything about that person negatively. The truly eerie aspect of the Horn effect is that once it takes hold, people often become convinced they are seeing someone's true character, when in reality, they may be reacting to a single flaw that has quietly colored every judgment that followed. The mere exposure effect. The mere exposure effect is one of the most fascinating and unsettling psychological phenomena because it suggests that people can develop preferences, trust, and even affection for something simply because they encounter it repeatedly. Most individuals believe they like certain people, ideas, or things because of their qualities. However, this effect reveals that familiarity alone can quietly influence attraction, often without conscious awareness. At its core, the mere exposure effect occurs when repeated exposure to a person, object, symbol, or message increases positive feelings toward it. The first encounter may produce little reaction. The second feels slightly more familiar. After enough repetitions, that familiarity begins to create comfort. What once felt unknown or neutral gradually starts to feel safe, acceptable, and even appealing. The reason this happens lies deep within human psychology. Throughout history, unfamiliar things often represented uncertainty and potential danger, while familiar things signaled safety and predictability. As a result, the brain evolved to respond more positively to what it recognizes. Familiarity reduces mental effort, and the mind often interprets that ease as a positive feeling. What makes this phenomenon particularly eerie is how subtly it operates. People often assume their preferences are the result of careful thought and personal choice. In reality, repeated exposure may be quietly shaping those preferences behind the scenes. A face seen frequently can become more attractive. A song heard repeatedly can become more enjoyable. An idea encountered over and over can begin to feel more reasonable. This effect helps explain why advertising, political messaging, social media, and public influence campaigns rely so heavily on repetition. The more often something appears, the more familiar it becomes, and familiarity can slowly transform into acceptance. The truly unsettling aspect of the mere exposure effect is that people rarely recognize it while it is happening. They often believe they genuinely like something for its value or merit, never realizing that repeated exposure alone may have played a powerful role in creating that feeling of attraction and trust. The contrast effect. The contrast effect is one of the most deceptive psychological phenomena because it reveals that people rarely judge things in absolute terms. Instead, they often evaluate them by comparing them to whatever they have just experienced. This means that the same person, situation, or object can appear completely different depending on what came before it. What feels impressive in one moment may seem ordinary in another, even though nothing about it has actually changed. At its core, the contrast effect occurs when the perception of something is influenced by a comparison rather than by its true qualities. Imagine lifting a heavy box and then picking up a lighter one. The lighter box suddenly feels almost weightless. The weight did not change, but your perception did. The same principle applies to people, emotions, decisions, and social interactions. The reason this effect is so powerful lies in the way the brain processes information. Human beings naturally seek reference points. Rather than evaluating every situation from scratch, the mind compares new experiences to recent ones. This shortcut saves mental effort but often creates distorted judgments. A person may seem more attractive when standing next to someone less attractive. An average offer may seem exceptional when compared to a terrible one presented first. What makes the contrast effect particularly unsettling is how easily it can be used to influence behavior. Salespeople, negotiators, advertisers, and manipulators often understand that perception can be shaped by controlling comparisons. By presenting an extreme option first, they can make another option appear far more reasonable than it truly is. The emotional impact of this phenomenon is profound because it affects choices people believe are entirely their own. Decisions about relationships, careers, purchases, and even personal worth can be influenced by carefully arranged comparisons. The truly eerie aspect of the contrast effect is that people often feel certain they are making objective judgments, never realizing that their perception may have been quietly altered by something they encountered only moments before. The foot-in-the-door technique. The foot-in-the-door technique is one of the most powerful and unsettling persuasion strategies because it demonstrates how a small agreement can quietly open the path to much larger compliance later. Most people believe they would immediately recognize when someone is trying to influence them. Yet, this technique works precisely because the initial request appears so harmless that it rarely triggers suspicion. At its core, the foot-in-the-door technique begins with a small request that is easy to accept. Once a person agrees, a second, larger request follows. What makes this strategy so effective is that people have a deep psychological need to see themselves as consistent. After saying yes once, they become more likely to say yes again, because refusing may feel like contradicting their own behavior. The reason this phenomenon works lies in self-perception. Human beings often learn about themselves by observing their actions. When someone agrees to a small favor, their mind may unconsciously conclude, "I must be the kind of person who supports this cause," or "I must be someone who helps others." Once that identity begins to form, larger requests become easier to accept because they feel aligned with the image the person now holds of themselves. What makes the foot-in-the-door technique particularly eerie is how gradual the process can be. The first request may seem insignificant on its own. A quick favor, a simple commitment, or a minor act of cooperation often feels harmless. Yet each agreement creates a psychological foundation for the next one, slowly increasing compliance without the individual realizing how far they have moved from their original position. This technique is widely used in marketing, fundraising, negotiations, social influence, and interpersonal relationships. While it can be used ethically, it also has a darker side. Manipulative individuals often understand that major requests are usually rejected. but a series of small requests can gradually lower resistance. The truly unsettling aspect of the foot-in-the-door technique is that people often believe every decision was made independently, never realizing that a tiny yes from the beginning may have quietly shaped every yes that followed. The door-in-the-face technique. The door-in-the-face technique is one of the most fascinating and psychologically unsettling persuasion strategies because it turns rejection into a tool for gaining compliance. Most people assume that when someone says no to a request, the interaction is over. However, this technique uses that initial refusal as the first step in guiding a person towards saying yes. At its core, the door-in-the-face technique begins with a request that is intentionally large, unreasonable, or difficult to accept. The person is expected to reject it. After the refusal, a second and much smaller request is presented. Compared to the first demand, the new request suddenly appears far more reasonable and acceptable, even if it is still something the person might have rejected under normal circumstances. The reason this technique works lies in two powerful psychological forces. The first is the contrast effect. The smaller request seems modest simply because it follows an extreme one. The second is the social norm of reciprocity. When the requester appears to compromise by lowering their demand, the other person often feels a subtle pressure to meet them halfway by agreeing to the smaller request. What makes this phenomenon particularly eerie is how naturally it can influence decision-making. People often feel that agreeing to the second request was entirely their own choice. They rarely recognize that their perception of the request was altered by the larger demand that came before it. The comparison quietly changes what feels reasonable. This technique is commonly used in sales, negotiations, fundraising, and social influence. Skilled persuaders understand that asking for too much at first can make a later request seem surprisingly attractive. There is also a darker side to this strategy. Manipulative individuals may deliberately create situations where rejection is expected, knowing that the refusal increases the likelihood of later compliance. The truly unsettling aspect of the door-in-the-face technique is that people often focus on the request they accepted, never realizing that the outcome was heavily shaped by the impossible request they rejected only moments earlier. The lowball technique. The lowball technique is one of the most deceptive psychological persuasion strategies because it reveals how people can become committed to a decision before they know the full cost of what they have agreed to. Most individuals believe they carefully evaluate situations before making choices. However, this technique exploits a powerful tendency within human nature. Once people commit to something, they often feel compelled to stay consistent with that commitment even when circumstances change. At its core, the lowball technique begins with an attractive offer. The request, opportunity, or deal appears highly appealing, making it easy for someone to agree. After the commitment has been made, important details are changed, hidden costs appear, or additional demands are introduced. Logically, the person should reconsider and walk away. Surprisingly, many choose to continue despite receiving less than they originally expected. The reason this phenomenon works lies in psychological commitment and consistency. Once individuals make a decision, they begin mentally justifying it. They imagine the benefits, visualize the outcome, and start seeing themselves as someone who has already chosen that path. Backing out later creates discomfort because it feels like admitting they made a mistake. As a result, many remain committed even when the situation becomes less favorable. What makes the lowball technique particularly unsettling is how easily it can influence intelligent and cautious people. The initial agreement creates momentum. By the time the hidden conditions emerge, emotional investment has already formed. The decision no longer feels like a fresh choice, but rather a continuation of something already started. This technique is commonly used in sales, negotiations, marketing, and interpersonal influence. While it can occasionally appear in harmless situations, it is often associated with manipulation because the true terms are not presented up front. The truly eerie aspect of the lowball technique is that people often convince themselves they are acting rationally after the change occurs. In reality, their desire to remain consistent may be quietly driving the decision, making them accept conditions they would have rejected if those same conditions had been presented from the very beginning. The bait-and-switch technique. The bait-and-switch technique is one of the most deceptive and psychologically unsettling influence strategies because it relies on attracting people with something they want, only to redirect them towards something entirely different. Most individuals believe they make decisions based on clear information and personal choice. However, this technique exploits the fact that once people become emotionally invested in an opportunity, they are often more willing to accept alternatives they would have previously rejected. At its core, the bait-and-switch technique begins with an attractive offer, opportunity, or promise. The initial option appears highly desirable and is specifically designed to capture attention and generate interest. Once a person becomes engaged and committed to pursuing it, they discover that the original option is unavailable, withdrawn, or somehow no longer possible. At that moment, a replacement is presented as the next best alternative. The reason this technique works lies in psychological momentum. Once people invest time, attention, effort, or emotion into pursuing something, they become reluctant to walk away empty-handed. The mind begins focusing on preserving the investment already made. Instead of starting over, many choose to accept the substitute, even when it is less appealing than the original offer. What makes the bait-and-switch technique particularly disturbing is how it manipulates expectations. The initial attraction is not necessarily intended to be fulfilled. Its primary purpose is to lower resistance and create involvement. By the time the switch occurs, the person is already emotionally engaged, making them more vulnerable to influence. This strategy has appeared in advertising, sales, negotiations, and various forms of social manipulation. While ethical regulations often limit its use in business, similar psychological patterns continue to appear in everyday interactions. The truly eerie aspect of the bait-and-switch technique is that people often believe they freely chose the final outcome. In reality, their decision may have been shaped long before the alternative was introduced. The original promise served as the bait, and by the time they realized it, their commitment had already made the switch far easier to accept than it should have been. The peak technique. The peak technique is one of the most subtle yet surprisingly powerful persuasion methods because it works by interrupting the automatic way people respond to requests. Most individuals move through daily life on mental autopilot, relying on habits and quick judgments to make decisions. When confronted with a familiar request, they often give a predictable answer without much thought. The peak technique exploits this tendency by introducing something unusual that forces the mind to pay attention. At its core, the technique involves making a request in a way that is slightly unexpected or distinctive. Instead of asking for a common amount, using a standard phrase, or presenting a familiar appeal, the requester introduces an unusual detail. That small difference creates a moment of curiosity. The automatic response is interrupted, and the person becomes more likely to consider the request rather than dismiss it immediately. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the brain's attraction to novelty. Human beings are naturally drawn to things that stand out from their surroundings. When something breaks a familiar pattern, the mind briefly shifts from automatic processing into conscious attention. During that moment, resistance often decreases because the person is no longer relying solely on routine responses. What makes the peak technique particularly fascinating is how small the change can be. A slight variation in wording, an unusual request, or an unexpected detail may be enough to capture attention and increase compliance. The influence does not come from pressure or force, but from making the brain pause and think. There is also a darker side to this technique. Skilled manipulators understand that attracting attention is often the first step toward gaining influence. By creating curiosity or surprise, they can bypass automatic skepticism and encourage people to engage with requests they might otherwise ignore. The truly unsettling aspect of the peak technique is that people often believe they carefully considered the decision on their own. In reality, a simple interruption of their normal thinking process may have quietly guided their attention, making them more open to persuasion than they ever realized. The disrupt-then-reframe technique. The disrupt-then-reframe technique is one of the most intriguing psychological persuasion strategies because it works by briefly confusing the mind and then immediately providing a new way to interpret the situation. Most people believe they make decisions through careful reasoning and logical analysis. However, this technique reveals that even a moment of mental disruption can make individuals surprisingly vulnerable to influence. At its core, the technique involves two stages. First, a person's normal pattern of thinking is interrupted with something unexpected, confusing, or unusual. This disruption creates a brief moment where the brain struggles to process what it has just encountered. Before the mind has time to fully recover and analyze the situation, a new explanation or interpretation is presented. The person is then guided toward viewing the situation through this newly framed perspective. The reason this technique works lies in how the human brain handles uncertainty. When people become momentarily confused, they naturally seek clarity and understanding. During that brief period, they become more receptive to information that helps restore a sense of order. The new explanation feels appealing because it resolves the discomfort created by the disruption. What makes this phenomenon particularly unsettling is how quickly it can influence judgment. A person may believe they are making a thoughtful decision when, in reality, their perception was shaped during a fleeting moment of confusion. The reframed message often feels reasonable simply because it arrived at the exact moment the brain was searching for clarity. This technique has been observed in marketing, sales, negotiations, and social influence. Skilled persuaders understand that disrupting routine thought patterns can make people more open to alternative viewpoints and suggestions. There is also a darker side to this strategy. Manipulative individuals may deliberately create confusion to weaken critical thinking before presenting the interpretation they want others to accept. The truly eerie aspect of the disrupt then reframe technique is that people often remember the conclusion they reached but never recognize how their thinking was subtly redirected during those few vulnerable moments when certainty temporarily disappeared. The Reciprocity Principle. The Reciprocity Principle is one of the most powerful and deeply rooted psychological forces because it reveals how strongly human beings feel compelled to return favors, kindness, and generosity. Most people believe they make decisions independently, guided by personal values and rational thought. Yet beneath the surface exists a powerful social rule that has shaped human behavior for thousands of years. When someone gives us something, we often feel an overwhelming urge to give something back. At its core, the Reciprocity Principle is based on the idea that favors create invisible obligations. When a person receives help, a gift, a compliment, or even a small act of kindness, a subtle psychological debt is often created. The recipient may not consciously recognize it, but the mind begins seeking ways to restore balance. This pressure can be surprisingly strong, even when the original favor was unsolicited. The reason this principle is so effective lies in human evolution. Throughout history, cooperation increased survival. Communities functioned more effectively when people helped one another and returned assistance when needed. Over time, the expectation of reciprocity became deeply embedded within human psychology. As a result, failing to return a favor can create feelings of guilt, discomfort, or social anxiety. What makes this phenomenon particularly unsettling is that the size of the return is not always proportional to the original gesture. A small favor can sometimes lead people to make much larger concessions later. The simple act of receiving something can lower resistance and increase willingness to comply with future requests. This principle is widely used in marketing, sales, negotiations, relationships, and social influence. Skilled persuaders understand that giving first often creates a powerful sense of obligation that makes later requests more effective. There is also a darker side to reciprocity. Manipulative individuals may offer favors, gifts, attention, or support, not out of genuine kindness, but as a strategic investment. The truly eerie aspect of the reciprocity principle is that people often believe they are acting out of free choice, never realizing how strongly an invisible feeling of debt may be guiding their decisions behind the scenes. The Scarcity Principle. The scarcity principle is one of the most powerful psychological forces because it reveals a strange truth about human nature. People often desire something more when they believe it is becoming difficult to obtain. Most individuals assume they value things based on their actual usefulness, quality, or importance. However, scarcity can dramatically increase perceived value, making ordinary opportunities suddenly feel urgent, desirable, and emotionally significant. At its core, the scarcity principle occurs when limited availability increases attraction. An item that was ignored yesterday may suddenly become highly sought after once people learn that only a few remain. A person who seemed ordinary may appear more desirable when attention from others becomes apparent. The possibility of loss transforms perception, making something feel more valuable than it did before. The reason this phenomenon works lies deep within human psychology. Throughout history, scarce resources were often essential for survival. Food, shelter, territory, and opportunities could disappear quickly. As a result, the human brain evolved to pay close attention to anything that appeared limited. Scarcity triggers a sense of urgency because the mind interprets limited availability as a signal that something must be important. What makes this effect particularly unsettling is how strongly it can influence emotions. When people fear losing access to something, logical thinking often becomes weaker. The focus shifts from evaluating whether something is truly valuable to worrying about the possibility of missing out. Desire becomes fueled by potential loss rather than genuine need. This principle is commonly used in advertising, marketing, negotiations, and social influence. Limited time offers, exclusive memberships, and countdown timers all rely on scarcity to increase motivation and action. There is also a darker side to this phenomenon. Manipulative individuals may create artificial scarcity to pressure others into making decisions they would not normally make. The truly eerie aspect of the scarcity principle is that people often believe they are pursuing something because they genuinely want it, when in reality, their desire may have been amplified by a simple fear that the opportunity might soon disappear forever. The commitment and consistency principle. The commitment and consistency principle is one of the most powerful psychological forces because it reveals how strongly human beings are driven to remain aligned with their previous decisions, statements, and actions. Most people believe they make choices based on current facts and circumstances. However, once a commitment has been made, the desire to appear consistent can become so strong that it influences future behavior in ways they never consciously intended. At its core, this principle suggests that people feel a deep psychological need to behave in ways that match their past commitments. Once someone publicly expresses an opinion, makes a promise, takes a position, or commits to a course of action, they often feel pressure to remain consistent with that choice. Changing direction may create discomfort because it can feel like admitting they were wrong, unreliable, or uncertain. The reason this phenomenon works lies in both social and internal pressures. Society tends to view consistency as a sign of honesty, stability, and trustworthiness. At the same time, individuals want to see themselves as rational and dependable. When actions and beliefs become misaligned, psychological tension begins to emerge. To reduce that discomfort, people often continue supporting previous commitments even when new information suggests they should reconsider. What makes this principle particularly unsettling is how small commitments can grow into much larger ones. A minor agreement today can create a powerful foundation for future compliance. Each step strengthens the person's attachment to the original decision, making it increasingly difficult to reverse course. This principle is widely used in persuasion, marketing, negotiations, leadership, and social influence. Skilled persuaders understand that gaining a small commitment often increases the likelihood of securing a larger one later. There is also a darker side to this phenomenon. Manipulative individuals may deliberately encourage small commitments, knowing that consistency will push people toward greater involvement over time. The truly eerie aspect of the commitment and consistency principle is that people often believe they are acting freely and logically, never realizing how much their present choices may be controlled by decisions they made long ago and now feel compelled to defend. The social proof effect. The social proof effect is one of the most powerful and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how often people look to others to determine what is true, safe, or acceptable. Most individuals like to believe they think independently and make decisions based on personal judgment. However, when uncertainty appears, the human mind frequently turns to the behavior of others for guidance. In many situations, people trust the crowd more than they trust their own instincts. At its core, the social proof effect occurs when individuals assume that a behavior is correct because many other people are doing it. If a restaurant is crowded, it appears more appealing. If a video has millions of views, it seems more credible. If large numbers of people support an idea, others often become more willing to accept it as well. The actions of the group become a shortcut for determining what is likely right. The reason this phenomenon exists lies deep within human evolution. For thousands of years, survival often depended on staying connected to the group. Following the crowd could provide protection, resources, and information about potential dangers. As a result, the brain developed a tendency to view collective behavior as valuable evidence when making decisions. What makes the social proof effect particularly disturbing is that the crowd is not always correct. Large groups can spread misinformation, reinforce harmful beliefs, or make poor decisions together. Yet the simple fact that many people believe something can make it feel more convincing, regardless of whether it is actually true. This effect is commonly used in advertising, social media, politics, marketing, and persuasion. Testimonials, reviews, follower counts, and popularity rankings all rely on social proof to influence perception. There is also a darker side to this phenomenon. Manipulative individuals may create the illusion of widespread support to gain trust and compliance. The truly eerie aspect of the social proof effect is that people often believe they are making independent choices, never realizing how strongly the behavior of strangers may be shaping their thoughts, beliefs, and actions behind the scenes. The authority principle. The authority principle is one of the most powerful psychological forces because it reveals how easily people can be influenced by those they perceive as experts, leaders, or figures of importance. Most individuals believe they evaluate information based on evidence, logic, and personal judgment. However, when someone appears to possess authority, the human mind often lowers its skepticism and becomes more willing to accept what is being said without careful examination. At its core, the authority principle occurs when people give greater weight to the opinions, instructions, or beliefs of someone they view as knowledgeable or powerful. A person wearing a uniform, holding an impressive title, displaying credentials, or speaking with confidence may instantly appear more credible. The authority itself becomes a shortcut for trust, reducing the need for independent evaluation. The reason this phenomenon exists lies deep within human history. Throughout evolution, following experienced leaders often improved survival. Those with knowledge, status, or expertise could help groups avoid danger and make better decisions. Over time, the tendency to respect authority became deeply embedded within human psychology. As a result, people often associate authority with correctness, even when there is little evidence to support that assumption. What makes the authority principle particularly unsettling is how quickly it can override critical thinking. Individuals may agree with statements, follow instructions, or adopt beliefs simply because they come from a respected figure. The authority becomes more influential than the information itself. This effect appears everywhere in society. Experts are consulted, leaders are followed, and public figures shape opinions on a massive scale. In many situations, this trust is beneficial because genuine expertise can provide valuable guidance. There is also a darker side to this principle. Manipulative individuals may use titles, symbols of status, or displays of confidence to create the appearance of authority without possessing genuine expertise. The truly eerie aspect of the authority principle is that people often believe they are trusting facts and evidence, when in reality, they may be placing their trust in the person delivering the message rather than the message itself. The liking principle. The liking principle is one of the most fascinating psychological forces because it reveals how strongly human beings are influenced by people they like. Most individuals believe they make decisions based on facts, logic, and careful reasoning. Yet research consistently shows that people are far more likely to agree with, trust, and comply with those they find attractive, relatable, friendly, or similar to themselves. In many situations, who delivers a message can be more influential than the message itself. At its core, the liking principle suggests that people are naturally drawn toward individuals they feel connected to. Similar interests, shared experiences, physical attractiveness, compliments, humor, and familiarity can all increase likability. Once that positive connection forms, resistance often decreases. Suggestions seem more reasonable, requests feel less demanding, and opinions become easier to accept. The reason this phenomenon works lies deep within human social nature. Throughout history, cooperation and survival often depended on forming strong relationships with trusted members of the group. As a result, the brain developed a tendency to associate positive feelings with safety and reliability. When someone is liked, their words often receive the benefit of the doubt before they are fully evaluated. What makes the liking principle particularly unsettling is how subtly it can influence judgment. People may believe they are making objective decisions while unconsciously favoring those they personally enjoy. A charming individual may be trusted more than a qualified expert. A friendly stranger may seem more credible simply because they create a pleasant emotional experience. This principle is widely used in sales, leadership, marketing, politics, and social influence. Skilled communicators understand that building likability often makes persuasion significantly easier. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals may carefully craft an appealing image, use compliments strategically, or create artificial similarities to gain trust. The truly eerie aspect of the liking principle is that people often assume their decisions are based on reason, never realizing how much a warm smile, shared interest, or feeling of familiarity may be quietly shaping their choices behind the scenes. The Unity Principle. The Unity Principle is one of the most powerful psychological forces because it taps into a deep human desire to belong to something larger than ourselves. Most people think of influence as something that happens through persuasion, arguments, or rewards. However, the Unity Principle operates on a much deeper level. It works by creating a sense of shared identity, making people feel that they are part of the same group, family, community, or cause. Once that feeling is established, influence becomes dramatically easier. At its core, the Unity Principle occurs when people stop seeing someone as an outsider and begin viewing them as one of their own. The moment this shift happens, trust often increases, defenses lower, and cooperation becomes more natural. Shared backgrounds, common experiences, group memberships, cultural connections, and collective goals can all create this powerful sense of unity. The reason this phenomenon works lies deep within human evolution. For thousands of years, survival depended on belonging to a group. Being accepted by the tribe meant protection, resources, and support. Being excluded could mean danger or even death. As a result, the human brain developed a strong tendency to favor those perceived as part of the same group while becoming more cautious around outsiders. What makes the Unity Principle particularly unsettling is how strongly it can influence judgment. People often extend trust, forgiveness, and loyalty to members of their group even when those individuals have not earned it. At the same time, they may judge outsiders more harshly or dismiss information that comes from them. This principle is commonly used in leadership, politics, religion, marketing, and social movements. By creating a strong sense of we instead of you and me, influence becomes far more effective. There is also a darker side to this phenomenon. Manipulative individuals may deliberately create a false sense of belonging to gain trust and loyalty. The truly eerie aspect of the Unity Principle is that people often believe they are making objective decisions, never realizing how much their choices may be influenced by a simple feeling that someone is one of us rather than one of them. The Cognitive Dissonance Effect. The cognitive dissonance effect is one of the most unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how far the human mind will go to protect its own sense of consistency. Most people believe they follow facts wherever they lead and adjust their beliefs when confronted with new evidence. However, when actions, beliefs, or values come into conflict, the mind often experiences a deep sense of psychological discomfort. Instead of changing behavior, people frequently change their interpretation of reality. At its core, cognitive dissonance occurs when a person holds two conflicting thoughts, beliefs, or behaviors at the same time. Imagine someone who values honesty but tells a lie, or someone who knows a habit is harmful yet continues doing it every day. The conflict creates mental tension that feels uncomfortable and difficult to ignore. The brain naturally seeks a way to reduce that discomfort and restore internal harmony. The reason this phenomenon is so powerful lies in the human need to see oneself as rational and consistent. People want to believe their choices make sense. When evidence suggests otherwise, the mind often begins creating explanations, excuses, or justifications that allow existing behavior to continue. Rather than changing the action, the belief may quietly shift to match it. What makes the cognitive dissonance effect particularly disturbing is that these mental adjustments often happen without conscious awareness. A person may genuinely believe the new explanation they have created. The justification feels real because it successfully reduces the psychological discomfort caused by the contradiction. This effect influences relationships, politics, habits, decision-making, and personal identity. It helps explain why people sometimes defend poor choices, remain loyal to false beliefs, or continue behaviors that clearly work against their own interests. There is also a darker side to this phenomenon. Manipulative individuals can intentionally create situations where others feel dissonance, knowing that the discomfort may push them toward compliance or belief changes. The truly eerie aspect of cognitive dissonance is that people often think they are discovering truth, when in reality, they may be unconsciously rewriting it to protect themselves from an uncomfortable contradiction. The confirmation bias. The confirmation bias is one of the most powerful and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals that people often do not search for the truth as much as they search for evidence that supports what they already believe. Most individuals like to think they are objective, open-minded, and willing to change their opinions when presented with new facts. However, the human mind has a natural tendency to favor information that confirms existing beliefs while ignoring, dismissing, or questioning information that challenges them. At its core, confirmation bias occurs when people selectively notice, remember, and interpret information in ways that reinforce their current views. Once a belief is formed, the mind begins acting like a filter. Supporting evidence is welcomed and remembered, while contradictory evidence is often overlooked or explained away. Over time, this creates the illusion that the belief is becoming stronger and more certain. The reason this phenomenon exists lies in the brain's desire for consistency and certainty. Challenging deeply held beliefs can create discomfort, confusion, and even anxiety. Accepting information that confirms existing views feels easier and more emotionally satisfying. The mind naturally gravitates toward what feels familiar and avoids what threatens its understanding of the world. What makes confirmation bias particularly disturbing is how invisible it can be. People rarely realize it is happening. They often believe they are evaluating information fairly when they are actually collecting evidence, like a lawyer defending a case that has already been decided. The conclusion comes first, and the supporting evidence follows. This bias influences relationships, politics, social media, careers, and everyday decision-making. It shapes what people read, who they trust, and how they interpret events around them. Entire groups can become trapped inside shared beliefs that feel unquestionably true because everyone is reinforcing the same perspective. There is also a darker side to this phenomenon. Manipulators often exploit confirmation bias by feeding people information that aligns with their existing views, making false claims feel more believable. The truly eerie aspect of confirmation bias is that people often feel most confident when they are most biased, never realizing that the evidence they trust may have been carefully selected by their own minds long before they reached a conclusion. The anchoring effect. The anchoring effect is one of the most fascinating and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how easily the human mind can become attached to the first piece of information it receives. Most people believe they make decisions by carefully evaluating all available facts. However, the reality is often very different. The first number, idea, impression, or piece of information presented can act like an invisible anchor, quietly influencing every judgment that follows. At its core, the anchoring effect occurs when people rely too heavily on an initial reference point when making decisions. Once an anchor is established, the mind tends to adjust around it rather than evaluating the situation from a completely neutral position. Even when the original information is irrelevant, inaccurate, or completely random, it can still shape perception in powerful ways. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the brain's need for efficiency. Faced with uncertainty, the mind looks for a starting point. The first information encountered becomes that starting point, creating a mental framework for future judgments. Instead of calculating value independently, people unconsciously compare everything to the anchor that was introduced first. What makes the anchoring effect particularly disturbing is how difficult it is to escape once it takes hold. A high price makes a lower price seem reasonable. An extreme expectation makes a moderate outcome feel acceptable. Even when people know they are being influenced, the anchor often continues affecting their decisions. This effect appears in negotiations, marketing, relationships, politics, and everyday life. Skilled persuaders understand that controlling the first number, idea, or impression can dramatically shape how people interpret everything that comes afterward. There is also a darker side to this phenomenon. Manipulative individuals may intentionally introduce extreme anchors to distort perception and make certain options appear more attractive than they truly are. The truly eerie aspect of the anchoring effect is that people often believe they reach their conclusions through independent reasoning, never realizing that an early piece of information may have quietly established the boundaries of their thinking long before the decision was ever made. The framing effect. The framing effect is one of the most powerful and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals that people often react not to the facts themselves, but to the way those facts are presented. Most individuals believe their decisions are based on logic, evidence, and objective reality. However, a simple change in wording can dramatically alter perception, emotions, and choices, even when the underlying information remains exactly the same. At its core, the framing effect occurs when different presentations of identical information lead people to reach different conclusions. A glass described as half full creates a different emotional reaction than a glass described as half empty, despite both statements being equally true. A medical treatment with a 90% survival rate feels far more appealing than one with a 10% mortality rate, even though the statistics are identical. The reason this phenomenon works lies in how the brain processes information. Human beings do not simply absorb facts, they interpret them through emotional and psychological filters. The words used to describe a situation create a mental frame that influences how the information is understood. That frame shapes perception before conscious analysis even begins. What makes the framing effect particularly disturbing is how easily it can influence major decisions. People may support or reject the same proposal depending entirely on how it is presented. A subtle shift in language can trigger hope, fear, confidence, or anxiety, leading to very different outcomes. This effect appears everywhere in daily life. Advertisers, politicians, negotiators, media outlets, and persuasive communicators frequently use framing to shape opinions and guide behavior. The message often remains the same, but the emotional response changes dramatically. There is also a darker side to this phenomenon. Manipulative individuals can carefully frame information to emphasize benefits while hiding risks, or to highlight losses while minimizing advantages. The truly eerie aspect of the framing effect is that people often believe they are responding to reality itself, never realizing that their emotions and decisions may have been heavily influenced by the particular frame through which that reality was presented. The Decoy Effect. The decoy effect is one of the most fascinating and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals that people's choices can be influenced by options they never intended to choose in the first place. Most individuals believe they evaluate alternatives based on their actual value and then select the one that best meets their needs. However, the decoy effect shows that introducing a carefully designed third option can dramatically change which choice appears most attractive. At its core, the decoy effect occurs when an additional option is added to a decision-making situation, not because it is expected to be chosen, but because it makes another option look better by comparison. The decoy is intentionally designed to be less appealing than one specific choice, while remaining somewhat similar to it. As a result, the targeted option suddenly appears more valuable, reasonable, or desirable than it did before. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the way the human brain compares alternatives. People often struggle to evaluate value in absolute terms. Instead, they rely on comparisons. When a decoy is introduced, it creates a new reference point that changes how the other options are perceived. The targeted choice begins to stand out as the obvious winner, even though nothing about it has actually changed. What makes the decoy effect particularly disturbing is that people rarely notice it happening. They often feel completely confident that they independently selected the best option. In reality, their perception may have been quietly shaped by an alternative that was never intended to be chosen. This effect is commonly used in marketing, pricing strategies, negotiations, and consumer psychology. Businesses frequently introduce products, plans, or packages specifically designed to make another option appear more attractive. There is also a darker side to this phenomenon. Manipulative individuals can structure choices in ways that steer people toward predetermined outcomes while maintaining the illusion of freedom and control. The truly eerie aspect of the decoy effect is that people often believe they are comparing real alternatives objectively, never realizing that an option they never wanted may have secretly guided them toward the decision they ultimately made. The sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy is one of the most emotionally powerful and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how difficult it is for people to let go of something they have already invested in. Most individuals believe they make decisions based on what is best for the future. However, the sunk cost fallacy causes people to remain committed to failing situations simply because they have already spent time, effort, money, emotions, or energy on them. At its core, the sunk cost fallacy occurs when past investments influence present decisions, even when those investments cannot be recovered. Logically, what has already been spent should not affect future choices. Yet, the human mind often refuses to accept loss. The more someone has invested, the harder it becomes to walk away, even when continuing is clearly harmful or unproductive. The reason this phenomenon is so powerful lies in the emotional discomfort associated with admitting a mistake. Ending a bad relationship, abandoning a failed project, or changing a long-held belief can feel like acknowledging that previous efforts were wasted. To avoid that painful realization, people often continue investing, hoping the situation will eventually justify everything they have already sacrificed. What makes the sunk cost fallacy particularly disturbing is that it can trap individuals for years. People stay in unhappy relationships because of the years already spent together. They continue supporting failing ideas because they have defended them for so long. They keep pursuing goals that no longer serve them simply because they have already invested too much to quit. This phenomenon affects careers, finances, relationships, business decisions, and personal identity. The deeper the investment, the stronger the psychological pull becomes. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals may intentionally encourage others to make small investments at first, knowing that future commitments become easier once people feel emotionally attached. The truly eerie aspect of the sunk cost fallacy is that people often believe they are being loyal, determined, or resilient, when in reality they may be trapped by the ghost of a past investment that continues to control decisions long after its value has disappeared. The availability heuristic. The availability heuristic is one of the most fascinating and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how easily the human mind can confuse what is memorable with what is true. Most people believe they assess risks, probabilities, and situations based on facts and evidence. However, the brain often takes a shortcut by relying on whatever examples come to mind most quickly. As a result, people frequently judge reality based on what they can easily remember rather than what is actually most common or most likely. At its core, the availability heuristic occurs when individuals estimate the likelihood of an event based on how easily examples of that event can be recalled. If something is vivid, emotional, recent, or repeatedly discussed, it becomes easier to remember. The brain then interprets that ease of recall as evidence that the event must be frequent or important. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the brain's desire for efficiency. Evaluating every situation through detailed analysis would require enormous mental effort. Instead, the mind often uses memory as a shortcut. If examples appear quickly, the brain assumes they must be significant. Unfortunately, memorable events are not always representative of reality. What makes the availability heuristic particularly disturbing is how strongly emotions can influence it. Dramatic stories, shocking news reports, and emotionally charged experiences tend to remain in memory longer than ordinary events. As a result, people may overestimate dangers they frequently hear about while underestimating risks that receive little attention. This phenomenon influences fears, beliefs, decision-making, relationships, media consumption, and public opinion. It shapes what people worry about, what they avoid, and what they consider likely to happen. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulators can repeatedly expose people to specific stories, images, or narratives, making certain ideas feel more common and believable than they actually are. The truly eerie aspect of the availability heuristic is that people often feel absolutely certain their judgments are based on reality, never realizing that what seems true may simply be whatever happens to be most vivid, recent, or emotionally memorable in their minds. The Representativeness Heuristic. The representativeness heuristic is one of the most intriguing and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how easily people can mistake appearances for reality. Most individuals believe they evaluate situations carefully, weighing evidence before reaching conclusions. However, the human mind often relies on a shortcut that judges people, events, and situations based on how closely they resemble an existing mental stereotype. The result is that what seems likely can feel more convincing than what is actually true. At its core, the representativeness heuristic occurs when people assess probability by comparing something to a familiar pattern or category. If a person behaves in a way that matches a stereotype, others may assume they belong to that group, even when there is little evidence to support the conclusion. The mind becomes focused on resemblance rather than statistical reality. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the brain's need for speed and efficiency. Human beings constantly encounter large amounts of information. To simplify decision-making, the brain creates mental shortcuts that help categorize the world. When something appears similar to a known pattern, the mind quickly fills in the gaps, often without pausing to examine whether the assumption is accurate. What makes the representativeness heuristic particularly disturbing is how convincing it feels. A person may seem trustworthy because they look like someone's idea of a trustworthy individual. Another may seem suspicious simply because they fit a negative stereotype. These judgments often feel logical even when they are based on limited or misleading information. This phenomenon influences hiring decisions, relationships, social perceptions, financial choices, and everyday interactions. It shapes expectations before evidence has been fully considered. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals may intentionally create appearances that match positive stereotypes in order to gain trust and credibility. The truly eerie aspect of the representativeness heuristic is that people often believe they are making rational judgments about reality, never realizing that they may actually be responding to a mental image, allowing resemblance to quietly replace evidence as the basis for their conclusions. The false consensus effect. The false consensus effect is one of the most fascinating and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how easily people can become trapped inside their own perspective. Most individuals believe they see the world clearly and understand how others think. However, this effect causes people to overestimate how much others agree with their opinions, beliefs, values, and behaviors. As a result, they often assume their views are far more common and accepted than they actually are. At its core, the false consensus effect occurs when people use themselves as the standard for judging others. If they hold a particular belief, support a certain idea, or behave in a specific way, they naturally assume many other people think and act similarly. Their own experiences become the lens through which they interpret the attitudes of the wider world. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the limits of human perception. Most people spend time around individuals who share similar interests, backgrounds, values, and viewpoints. Because they are constantly exposed to familiar perspectives, those perspectives begin to feel normal and widespread. The brain then mistakes personal experience for universal reality. What makes the false consensus effect particularly disturbing is how confident it can make people feel. When individuals believe large numbers of others agree with them, their opinions often seem more valid and justified. This confidence can make them less willing to question their assumptions or consider alternative viewpoints. The illusion of widespread support strengthens existing beliefs. This phenomenon influences relationships, politics, social media, workplace interactions, and group dynamics. It shapes expectations about how others will react, often leading to misunderstandings and disappointment when reality does not match those assumptions. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals may exploit the human desire for belonging by creating the impression that a belief or behavior is more common than it really is. The truly eerie aspect of the false consensus effect is that people often feel surrounded by agreement even when they are not. Without realizing it, they may be living inside a psychological echo chamber, mistaking familiarity for consensus and assumption for reality. The Spotlight Effect. The Spotlight Effect is one of the most fascinating and emotionally powerful psychological phenomena because it reveals a strange illusion that affects nearly everyone. Most people spend a significant portion of their lives worrying about how they appear to others. They replay conversations, obsess over mistakes, and fear being judged for flaws that seem impossible to hide. Yet the spotlight effect suggests that people are paying far less attention to us than we imagine. At its core, the spotlight effect occurs when individuals greatly overestimate how much other people notice their appearance, behavior, mistakes, or personal shortcomings. The mind creates the feeling that a giant spotlight is constantly shining on us, making every awkward moment, embarrassing comment, or visible flaw seem impossible for others to miss. In reality, most people are far more focused on themselves than on anyone else. The reason this phenomenon exists lies in the nature of human consciousness. Every person experiences life from their own perspective. Our thoughts, emotions, insecurities, and experiences are constantly present in our awareness, making them feel highly significant. Because our own actions occupy so much mental space, we unconsciously assume they occupy a similar amount of space in the minds of others. What makes the spotlight effect particularly unsettling is how strongly it can influence behavior. People avoid opportunities, remain silent, hide their true personalities, or live with unnecessary anxiety because they believe others are constantly evaluating them. A small mistake can feel enormous simply because it is impossible to escape within one's own mind. This phenomenon affects confidence, relationships, social interactions, public speaking, and self-esteem. It quietly shapes how people move through the world every day. There is also a darker side to this effect. Chronic fear of judgment can make individuals easier to manipulate because they become overly concerned with approval and acceptance. The truly eerie aspect of the spotlight effect is that people often spend years worrying about how closely they are being watched, never realizing that most of the audience they fear exists only in their imagination, while everyone else is busy standing beneath their own spotlight. The Barnum Effect. The Barnum Effect is one of the most fascinating and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how easily people can believe vague and general statements are uniquely describing them. Most individuals like to think they understand themselves deeply and can recognize when information is accurate or false. However, the Barnum Effect shows that when a description sounds personal enough, many people will accept it as highly accurate, even when the same description could apply to almost anyone. At its core, the Barnum Effect occurs when individuals interpret broad, ambiguous statements as specifically meaningful to their own lives. A person may hear that they sometimes doubt themselves despite appearing confident, that they desire approval but value independence, or that they possess untapped potential others fail to see. These statements feel personal because they contain experiences that nearly everyone can relate to in some way. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the human desire for self-understanding and meaning. People naturally search for patterns that explain who they are. When presented with information that appears insightful, the mind often focuses on the parts that feel true, while ignoring the fact that the description is broad enough to fit countless others. The emotional connection creates the illusion of accuracy. What makes the Barnum Effect particularly disturbing is how convincing it can feel. Individuals may become deeply attached to descriptions that contain little genuine information about them. The sense of being understood can be so powerful that skepticism disappears entirely. This phenomenon plays a major role in personality readings, fortune-telling, social influence, and many forms of persuasion. The more emotionally appealing the statement, the more likely people are to see themselves within it. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals often use vague yet flattering descriptions to gain trust, credibility, and influence over others. The truly eerie aspect of the Barnum Effect is that people often feel someone has uncovered hidden truths about them, when in reality they may simply be responding to carefully crafted statements designed to feel personal while actually applying to almost everyone who hears them. The Forer Effect. The Forer effect is one of the most intriguing and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how easily people can be convinced that a generic description was written specifically for them. Most individuals believe they can recognize when a personality assessment, observation, or analysis accurately reflects who they are. However, the Forer effect demonstrates that people often accept vague and broadly applicable statements as highly personal and remarkably precise. The phenomenon is named after psychologist Bertram Forer, who conducted a famous experiment in which participants completed personality tests and were later given what they believed were individualized results. In reality, every participant received the exact same personality description. Surprisingly, most rated the assessment as highly accurate, convinced that it captured unique aspects of their character. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the way people process information about themselves. Human beings naturally search for meaning, patterns, and personal relevance. When reading a description, they focus on the parts that seem accurate while overlooking statements that are vague, contradictory, or applicable to nearly everyone. The mind actively participates in creating the illusion of precision. What makes the Forer effect particularly disturbing is how strongly emotions can reinforce belief. People want to feel understood. They are drawn to information that suggests someone has uncovered hidden truths about their personality, motivations, or future. That emotional desire can make even generic statements feel surprisingly profound and insightful. This phenomenon influences personality tests, fortune-telling, astrology, psychic readings, self-help programs, and many forms of persuasion. The more positive and emotionally resonant the description, the more likely people are to accept it as uniquely meaningful. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals can use generalized observations to create the impression of extraordinary insight, gaining trust and credibility in the process. The truly eerie aspect of the Forer effect is that people often feel deeply understood by someone who knows almost nothing about them, never realizing that their own minds may be filling in the details and transforming a universal description into something that feels intensely personal. The self-fulfilling prophecy. The self-fulfilling prophecy is one of the most fascinating and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how beliefs can quietly shape reality. Most people assume that their expectations are simply predictions about what might happen in the future. However, this effect suggests that expectations often do much more than predict outcomes. They can influence behavior in ways that actually help create the very outcome that was expected from the beginning. At its core, a self-fulfilling prophecy occurs when a belief influences actions that make the belief come true. A person who expects rejection may become distant, nervous, or withdrawn around others. Those behaviors can push people away, ultimately creating the rejection they feared. Likewise, someone who expects success may act with confidence and persistence, increasing the likelihood of achieving the desired result. The reason this phenomenon is so powerful lies in the connection between thoughts and behavior. Human beings rarely act independently of their beliefs. Expectations influence emotions, attention, decisions, and reactions. Over time, these small behavioral changes accumulate, subtly shaping circumstances until reality begins to mirror the original belief. What makes the self-fulfilling prophecy particularly disturbing is that people often remain unaware of their role in creating the outcome. They focus on the result while overlooking the countless actions that contributed to it. The prophecy appears to have been correct all along, even though it may have helped produce the very evidence that seems to confirm it. This phenomenon affects relationships, careers, education, personal growth, and social interactions. Positive expectations can encourage achievement and resilience, while negative expectations can quietly sabotage opportunities and reinforce fears. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals may plant expectations in others, knowing those beliefs can influence future behavior. The truly eerie aspect of the self-fulfilling prophecy is that people often believe they are merely observing reality unfold, never realizing that their own expectations may have been silently guiding events in that direction from the very beginning, turning belief into destiny without their awareness. The Pygmalion Effect. The Pygmalion Effect is one of the most fascinating psychological phenomena because it reveals that the expectations people hold about others can significantly influence how those individuals perform. Most people believe success or failure is determined mainly by talent, intelligence, effort, or opportunity. However, the Pygmalion Effect suggests that something far less visible can shape outcomes just as powerfully: the expectations of those around us. At its core, the Pygmalion Effect occurs when higher expectations lead to improved performance. When a teacher believes a student is capable of great things, they may unknowingly provide more encouragement, attention, patience, and opportunities. When a manager believes an employee has exceptional potential, they may offer greater support and trust. Over time, these subtle differences in treatment can help the person perform at a higher level, making the original expectation appear correct. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the powerful connection between perception and behavior. Expectations influence how people communicate, interact, and respond to others. Positive expectations often create an environment where confidence can grow. The individual receiving that treatment begins to internalize those beliefs, gradually seeing themselves through the same positive lens. What makes the Pygmalion effect particularly unsettling is that it often operates beneath conscious awareness. Neither the person holding the expectation nor the person affected by it may realize what is happening. Small differences in attention, tone, body language, and opportunity quietly accumulate until they begin shaping reality. This phenomenon influences education, leadership, relationships, workplaces, sports, and personal development. It demonstrates how powerful belief can be when it is expressed through everyday actions. There is also a darker side to this effect. Positive expectations can elevate people, but unrealistic expectations can create pressure, anxiety, and fear of failure. The truly eerie aspect of the Pygmalion effect is that someone else's belief about who you are may begin influencing who you become. Without realizing it, people can spend years living up to expectations they never consciously chose, allowing another person's perception to quietly shape the course of their lives. The Golem Effect. The Golem Effect is one of the most disturbing psychological phenomena because it reveals how negative expectations can quietly limit a person's potential and influence their future. Most people believe that failure is caused by a lack of ability, effort, or opportunity. However, the Golem Effect suggests that sometimes failure begins with something much less visible: the low expectations that others hold about us. At its core, the Golem Effect occurs when negative expectations lead to poorer performance. When a teacher believes a student is unlikely to succeed, they may unknowingly provide less encouragement, fewer opportunities, and lower levels of support. When a manager assumes an employee lacks potential, they may offer less trust, guidance, and responsibility. Over time, these subtle differences in treatment can reduce confidence and motivation, making poor performance more likely. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the powerful relationship between expectations and behavior. Human beings are highly sensitive to how others perceive them. Even when negative expectations are not openly expressed, they often appear through body language, tone of voice, patience levels, and daily interactions. The person receiving these signals may gradually begin to internalize them, accepting the possibility that the negative judgment is true. What makes the Golem Effect particularly unsettling is how invisible it can be. The individual experiencing it may never realize that their environment is shaping their confidence and performance. They simply see the outcome and assume it reflects their true ability. Meanwhile, the low expectations continue reinforcing the cycle. This phenomenon influences schools, workplaces, relationships, sports, and social groups. It can quietly suppress growth and achievement, even among highly capable individuals. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals may intentionally lower someone's confidence through criticism, doubt, or discouragement in order to gain control or maintain superiority. The truly eerie aspect of the Golem Effect is that a person's limitations may not always originate from within. Sometimes they begin as someone else's belief. Over time, that belief can become a reality, transforming a prediction into a result and causing people to live beneath their true potential without ever realizing why. The Rosenthal Effect. The Rosenthal Effect is one of the most fascinating psychological phenomena because it reveals that human potential is often shaped by the expectations of others. Most people assume that performance is determined solely by intelligence, talent, effort, or experience. However, the Rosenthal Effect suggests that what others believe about us can quietly influence how we think, behave, and ultimately perform. In many cases, expectations become invisible forces that help create the very outcomes they predict. The phenomenon is named after psychologist Robert Rosenthal, whose research demonstrated that expectations can influence performance in remarkable ways. In one famous study, teachers were led to believe that certain students showed exceptional academic potential. Although the students had been selected randomly, many of them later demonstrated greater improvement than their peers. The expectations alone appeared to alter the way they were treated, which in turn influenced their development. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the subtle ways expectations affect behavior. When people believe someone is capable, they often provide more encouragement, attention, patience, and opportunities. These small differences may seem insignificant on their own, but over time, they accumulate. The individual begins receiving signals that they are expected to succeed, and those signals can strengthen confidence, motivation, and persistence. What makes the Rosenthal effect particularly unsettling is how invisible it often remains. Neither the person holding the expectation nor the person being influenced may recognize what is happening. The belief quietly shapes interactions until reality begins to reflect the original expectation. This phenomenon affects schools, workplaces, sports teams, relationships, and personal growth. It demonstrates that human performance is not influenced only by internal abilities, but also by the beliefs embedded within the surrounding environment. There is also a darker side to this effect. Expectations can create pressure, unrealistic standards, or dependency on external validation. The truly eerie aspect of the Rosenthal effect is that people often believe they are becoming who they truly are, never realizing how much of their growth may have been influenced by the expectations someone else placed upon them long before they believed in themselves. The placebo effect. The placebo effect is one of the most fascinating and mysterious psychological phenomena because it reveals the extraordinary power of belief over human experience. Most people assume that improvement only occurs when a real treatment, medication, or intervention is applied. However, the placebo effect shows that simply believing something will help can sometimes produce measurable changes in thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and even physical symptoms. At its core, the placebo effect occurs when a person experiences improvement after receiving a treatment that contains no active therapeutic ingredient. The treatment itself may have no direct biological effect, yet the expectation of improvement triggers real changes within the mind and body. The belief becomes powerful enough to influence perception and experience. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the close connection between the brain and the body. Expectations can influence emotions, attention, stress levels, motivation, and even certain physiological responses. When people genuinely believe they are receiving help, the brain may begin responding as though positive change is already underway. The expectation itself becomes part of the treatment. What makes the placebo effect particularly unsettling is that the improvement can feel completely real. The person is not pretending, imagining, or consciously deceiving themselves. Their experience is genuine. Yet the source of that improvement may come not from the treatment itself, but from their belief in it. This challenges many assumptions about how change actually occurs. The placebo effect influences medicine, therapy, performance, motivation, and everyday life. It demonstrates that expectations can shape outcomes in ways that are often invisible but surprisingly powerful. There is also a darker side to this phenomenon. Manipulative individuals may exploit belief, confidence, and expectation to convince others that ineffective solutions are producing real results. The truly eerie aspect of the placebo effect is that it blurs the line between reality and perception. People often assume that improvement proves a treatment works, never realizing that the human mind itself may have played a far greater role than anyone initially suspected. The Nocebo Effect. The Nocebo Effect is one of the most disturbing psychological phenomena because it reveals that negative expectations can sometimes create negative outcomes, even when there is no real cause for harm. Most people are familiar with the power of positive belief through the placebo effect. The Nocebo Effect represents the darker side of that same psychological force. It demonstrates how fear, expectation, and suggestion can influence the mind and body in surprisingly powerful ways. At its core, the nocebo effect occurs when a person experiences negative symptoms, discomfort, or worsening conditions because they expect something harmful to happen. The anticipated problem becomes so psychologically convincing that the body and mind begin responding as though the threat is real. In some cases, the expectation itself becomes the source of the suffering. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the brain's ability to influence perception and physical experience. When people expect pain, illness, failure, or danger, their attention becomes focused on signs that confirm those expectations. Minor sensations become magnified. Normal experiences may be interpreted as symptoms. Stress and anxiety increase, creating real emotional and physical consequences. What makes the nocebo effect particularly unsettling is that the suffering can feel completely genuine. The person is not imagining it in the sense of consciously inventing symptoms. Their discomfort is real, yet the source of that discomfort may be rooted not in an actual threat, but in the belief that one exists. This phenomenon influences health, performance, relationships, confidence, and everyday decision-making. Negative expectations can quietly shape experiences long before objective evidence appears. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals may intentionally plant fears, doubts, and negative expectations in others, knowing those beliefs can influence future outcomes. The truly eerie aspect of the nocebo effect is that the mind can become its own source of harm. People often fear external dangers, never realizing that a powerful expectation, repeated often enough and believed deeply enough, can begin producing consequences that feel frighteningly real even when no actual threat was present to begin with. The Zeigarnik Effect. The Zeigarnik Effect is one of the most fascinating and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals that unfinished things often have a stronger hold on the mind than completed ones. Most people assume that once something is out of sight, it gradually fades from awareness. However, the Zeigarnik Effect suggests that incomplete tasks, unresolved situations, and unanswered questions can linger in the mind for far longer than completed experiences, quietly demanding attention even when we want to move on. At its core, the Zeigarnik Effect occurs when unfinished activities remain more memorable than finished ones. A completed task allows the mind to relax and let go. An unfinished task, however, creates a sense of mental tension. The brain continues treating it as something that requires attention, making it more difficult to forget. This is why people often replay unresolved conversations, unfinished projects, or unanswered questions repeatedly in their thoughts. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the brain's desire for closure. Human beings are naturally uncomfortable with uncertainty and incompleteness. When something remains unresolved, the mind keeps returning to it in an attempt to achieve a sense of completion. Until that closure is reached, the mental tension often remains active in the background. What makes the Zeigarnik Effect particularly unsettling is how persistent it can be. A brief interaction, an unfinished goal, or a mystery without an answer can occupy far more mental space than major events that have already been resolved. The mind becomes trapped in a loop, repeatedly returning to what remains incomplete. This phenomenon influences relationships, storytelling, learning, productivity, and memory. It explains why cliffhangers are so effective and why unfinished emotional experiences can be difficult to forget. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals may deliberately leave questions unanswered or create emotional uncertainty to maintain attention and influence. The truly eerie aspect of the Zeigarnik Effect is that unfinished things often continue living inside the mind long after they should have been forgotten, quietly demanding energy, focus, and emotional space until some form of resolution is finally found. The peak end rule. The peak end rule is one of the most fascinating and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals that people often do not remember experiences as they actually happened. Most individuals assume that memories are created by carefully storing every moment and then averaging the overall experience. However, the human mind frequently takes a shortcut. Instead of remembering an entire event accurately, it places enormous weight on two specific moments, the emotional peak and the ending. At its core, the peak end rule suggests that people judge past experiences largely based on the most emotionally intense moment and the way the experience ended. The duration of the event often matters far less than most people realize. An experience filled with many positive moments can be remembered negatively if it ends badly. Likewise, a difficult experience may be remembered surprisingly favorably if it concludes on a positive note. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the brain's limited ability to store every detail equally. Human memory is not a perfect recording device. Instead, it tends to compress experiences into simplified emotional summaries. The moments that generate the strongest emotions become anchors in memory, while the ending often serves as the final impression that shapes the overall narrative. What makes the peak-end rule particularly unsettling is how dramatically it can distort reality. A person may spend months in a relationship, years in a job, or hours at an event, yet their memory of the entire experience may be heavily influenced by only a few moments. The emotional peak and the ending can overshadow everything in between. This phenomenon affects relationships, entertainment, education, customer experiences, and personal memories. It shapes how people remember major events long after they have ended. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals may strategically create powerful emotional moments or carefully control endings to influence how others remember an entire experience. The truly eerie aspect of the peak-end rule is that people often trust their memories completely, never realizing that what they remember most vividly may not represent the whole truth, but rather a story shaped by a few emotionally charged moments and a carefully remembered ending. The loss aversion effect. The loss aversion effect is one of the most powerful and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals that people often fear losing something far more than they value gaining something of equal worth. Most individuals believe they make decisions by weighing potential gains against potential losses in a rational way. However, the human mind does not treat gains and losses equally. The emotional pain of losing is often significantly stronger than the pleasure of gaining. At its core, the loss aversion effect occurs when people become more motivated to avoid losses than to pursue rewards. Losing $100 typically feels more painful than finding $100 feels pleasurable. The objective value may be identical, but the emotional impact is not. The mind treats loss as a threat, giving it greater psychological weight. The reason this phenomenon exists lies deep within human evolution. Throughout history, losing essential resources could have serious consequences for survival. Missing an opportunity was unfortunate, but losing food, shelter, protection, or social standing could be dangerous. As a result, the brain evolved to pay closer attention to potential losses than potential gains. What makes the loss aversion effect particularly disturbing is how strongly it can influence behavior. People often cling to unhealthy relationships, failing investments, outdated beliefs, or unsatisfying situations simply because letting go feels like accepting a loss. The fear of losing what already exists can become more powerful than the possibility of achieving something better. This phenomenon affects finances, careers, relationships, negotiations, decision-making, and everyday choices. It shapes risk-taking behavior and often causes individuals to act defensively rather than strategically. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals frequently frame situations around potential losses because they understand that fear is often a stronger motivator than opportunity. By emphasizing what someone might lose, they can create urgency and increase compliance. The truly eerie aspect of the loss aversion effect is that people often believe they are protecting themselves from harm, when in reality their fear of loss may be trapping them. Without realizing it, they can spend years defending what they already have while unknowingly sacrificing opportunities that could have transformed their future. The Endowment Effect. The Endowment Effect is one of the most fascinating and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how ownership can dramatically change perception. Most people believe the value of an object, opportunity, or possession is determined by its actual usefulness or market worth. However, the moment something becomes ours, the mind often begins treating it as more valuable than it really is. Ownership itself creates an emotional attachment that can distort judgment in surprising ways. At its core, the endowment effect occurs when people assign greater value to things simply because they own them. An item that seemed ordinary before possession can suddenly feel special once it belongs to us. The object has not changed, but our perception of it has. What was once just another item becomes part of our personal world, making it harder to evaluate objectively. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the deep psychological connection between ownership and identity. Human beings often extend their sense of self to include possessions, achievements, relationships, and beliefs. Once something becomes associated with us, losing it feels more personal. The mind begins treating the object not merely as a possession, but as something connected to who we are. What makes the endowment effect particularly disturbing is how easily it can influence decisions. People often refuse reasonable offers, overvalue what they already possess, and become emotionally attached to things they previously showed little interest in. The simple act of ownership changes perception without conscious awareness. This phenomenon affects finances, negotiations, relationships, collecting, investing, and everyday choices. It helps explain why people struggle to let go of possessions they rarely use or defend ideas they have emotionally invested in. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals and marketers often encourage people to experience ownership before making a commitment, knowing that attachment grows quickly once something feels like it belongs to them. The truly eerie aspect of the endowment effect is that people often believe they are recognizing genuine value, when in reality, they may simply be responding to a powerful illusion created by ownership itself. The moment something becomes theirs, its worth quietly expands inside their mind. The IKEA Effect. The IKEA Effect is one of the most fascinating and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals that people often place a higher value on things they helped create, even when the final result is no better than something made by someone else. Most individuals believe they judge quality objectively based on usefulness, craftsmanship, or actual performance. However, the IKEA effect suggests that effort itself can become a powerful source of perceived value. At its core, the IKEA effect occurs when people develop stronger attachment and appreciation for something because they invested time, energy, or work into creating it. The name comes from the experience of assembling furniture yourself. Even if the final product is ordinary, the effort involved in building it can make it feel more valuable than a similar item that arrived fully assembled. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the human desire to see effort as meaningful. People naturally want to believe that the time and energy they invest produce something worthwhile. When they contribute to the creation of an object, project, relationship, or idea, part of their identity becomes connected to the outcome. As a result, they often view it more positively than an outsider would. What makes the IKEA effect particularly unsettling is how easily it can distort judgment. Individuals may overestimate the quality of their own work, defend flawed creations, or become emotionally attached to things that others see as average. The effort invested becomes part of the value itself, making objective evaluation more difficult. This phenomenon influences business, creativity, relationships, education, hobbies, and personal achievements. It helps explain why people feel proud of projects they worked on and why self-created solutions often feel more satisfying than ready-made alternatives. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals and organizations sometimes encourage people to invest effort early because they know attachment grows with participation. The more work someone contributes, the harder it becomes to walk away. The truly eerie aspect of the IKEA effect is that people often believe they value something because it is genuinely exceptional, never realizing that their attachment may have less to do with the quality of the outcome and far more to do with the effort they poured into creating it themselves. The Ostrich Effect. The Ostrich Effect is one of the most unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how often people avoid information they do not want to face. Most individuals believe they would rather know the truth, even when it is uncomfortable. However, when confronted with threatening, stressful, or emotionally painful information, the human mind often chooses avoidance over awareness. Rather than confronting reality directly, people sometimes act as if ignoring a problem will somehow make it less real. At its core, the ostrich effect occurs when individuals deliberately avoid information that could cause anxiety, fear, guilt, or discomfort. The name comes from the popular myth that ostriches bury their heads in the sand when danger approaches. While actual ostriches do not behave this way, humans often do. They ignore warning signs, delay difficult conversations, avoid checking important results, or pretend a growing problem does not exist. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the brain's desire to protect itself from emotional distress. Bad news can trigger fear, uncertainty, and a sense of vulnerability. By avoiding the information, people experience temporary relief. The discomfort disappears for a moment, creating the illusion that the problem has been pushed away. Unfortunately, the underlying issue often remains unchanged or becomes worse over time. What makes the ostrich effect particularly disturbing is how rational the avoidance can feel. People convince themselves they are waiting for the right moment, gathering more information, or reducing stress. In reality, they may simply be postponing an unavoidable truth. This phenomenon affects finances, health, relationships, careers, and personal growth. It influences everything from avoiding medical checkups to ignoring relationship problems that have been building for years. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals can exploit people's tendency to avoid uncomfortable realities by keeping attention focused elsewhere. The truly eerie aspect of the ostrich effect is that people often believe they are escaping a problem when they are actually giving it more time to grow. By refusing to look directly at reality, they may unknowingly allow the very thing they fear to become stronger while remaining hidden just beneath the surface. The Dunning-Kruger Effect. The Dunning-Kruger Effect is one of the most fascinating and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals a strange flaw in human self-awareness. Most people assume that confidence is a reliable sign of competence. If someone speaks with certainty, appears convinced of their knowledge, and expresses strong opinions, others often assume they know what they are talking about. However, the Dunning-Kruger effect suggests that the opposite can sometimes be true. In certain situations, the people who know the least may be the most confident. At its core, the Dunning-Kruger effect occurs when individuals with limited knowledge or skill overestimate their own abilities. Because they lack expertise, they also lack the ability to accurately recognize their mistakes, weaknesses, and knowledge gaps. The very skills required to perform well are often the same skills required to evaluate performance correctly. The reason this phenomenon works lies in a paradox of learning. Beginners often know enough to feel confident, but not enough to understand how much they do not know. As people gain experience, they begin discovering the complexity of the subject. This increased awareness often causes confidence to decrease temporarily because they finally recognize the vast amount they have yet to learn. What makes the Dunning-Kruger effect particularly disturbing is how convincing false confidence can appear. People may make important decisions, influence others, or defend inaccurate beliefs while genuinely believing they possess expert understanding. Their certainty can be more persuasive than actual expertise. This phenomenon influences education, leadership, relationships, social media, politics, and everyday discussions. It affects both how people view themselves and how they evaluate others. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals may exploit confidence because they know many people mistake certainty for competence. The truly eerie aspect of the Dunning-Kruger effect is that ignorance can sometimes hide itself. The less someone knows, the less able they may be to recognize their own limitations. As a result, they can move through life feeling completely certain while remaining unaware that their confidence is built upon a foundation of misunderstanding rather than genuine knowledge. The curse of knowledge. The curse of knowledge is one of the most fascinating and frustrating psychological phenomena because it reveals how difficult it becomes to remember what it was like not to know something. Most people assume that once they learn new information, they can easily explain it to others. However, the human mind often falls into a hidden trap. The more knowledge a person gains, the harder it can become to imagine the perspective of someone who lacks that knowledge. At its core, the curse of knowledge occurs when informed individuals unknowingly assume that others possess the same background information, understanding, or context that they do. Once a fact becomes obvious to us, it feels difficult to imagine a time when it was not obvious. The knowledge becomes so deeply integrated into our thinking that we lose sight of how confusing it may appear to someone encountering it for the first time. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the way memory and learning operate. When people acquire knowledge, the brain reorganizes information around that understanding. New insights connect with existing knowledge, creating a framework that feels natural and intuitive. Over time, it becomes increasingly difficult to separate what is obvious now from what was once unknown. What makes the curse of knowledge particularly unsettling is how invisible it can be. Experts often struggle to explain concepts clearly because they unconsciously skip steps that seem self-evident. Teachers, leaders, professionals, and communicators may become frustrated when others fail to understand, unaware that their own expertise is creating a barrier to effective communication. This phenomenon affects education, relationships, leadership, business, and everyday conversations. It influences how people share information and how misunderstandings develop. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals may exploit knowledge gaps, assuming others will not recognize missing information or hidden details. The truly eerie aspect of the curse of knowledge is that the more someone knows, the more difficult it can become to understand those who know less. Without realizing it, expertise can create distance, causing people to forget what confusion feels like and making genuine understanding harder than they ever imagined. The third-person effect. The third-person effect is one of the most fascinating and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals a blind spot that exists in nearly everyone. Most people believe they are less vulnerable to influence, manipulation, and persuasion than those around them. They assume advertisements affect other people, propaganda influences other people, and misinformation deceives other people. The strange reality is that many individuals consider themselves exceptions while viewing others as far more susceptible to outside influence. At its core, the third-person effect occurs when people underestimate the impact that messages, media, and persuasion have on themselves while overestimating their impact on others. A person may watch an advertisement and confidently claim that it had no effect on them, yet believe countless others will be influenced by it. They see themselves as rational observers while imagining others as easier targets. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the human desire to maintain a positive self-image. People like to view themselves as intelligent, independent, and resistant to manipulation. Admitting that outside influences affect their thinking can feel uncomfortable because it challenges that perception. As a result, the mind creates a subtle illusion that influence works primarily on other people. What makes the third-person effect particularly disturbing is how convincing it feels. Individuals often become highly confident in their ability to recognize manipulation while remaining unaware of the ways they themselves are being influenced. The bias protects the ego while reducing self-awareness. This phenomenon affects politics, social media, advertising, news consumption, relationships, and everyday decision-making. It shapes how people interpret information and how they judge the behavior of others. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals often benefit from it because people who believe they cannot be influenced are less likely to question their own beliefs and reactions. The truly eerie aspect of the third-person effect is that the people who feel most immune to persuasion may sometimes be the least likely to notice it when it happens. While focusing on how others are being influenced, they may unknowingly lower their guard and become influenced themselves without ever realizing it. The fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error is one of the most fascinating and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how easily people misjudge the behavior of others. Most individuals believe they are good at understanding why people do what they do. When someone acts rudely, irresponsibly, or unexpectedly, it often feels natural to assume that the behavior reflects their true character. However, this psychological bias suggests that people frequently underestimate the power of circumstances and overestimate the role of personality. At its core, the fundamental attribution error occurs when individuals explain other people's actions by focusing on internal traits while ignoring external situations. If someone cuts us off in traffic, we may immediately assume they are selfish or reckless. If a coworker misses a deadline, we may conclude they are lazy or disorganized. Rarely do we first consider the possibility that stress, emergencies, pressure, or unseen circumstances may have influenced their behavior. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the way human perception is structured. We observe other people's actions but often cannot see the full context surrounding them. Their behavior is visible, but their circumstances remain hidden. As a result, the mind fills in the gaps by making assumptions about their personality rather than their situation. What makes the fundamental attribution error particularly disturbing is that people apply a different standard to themselves. When they make mistakes, they often blame circumstances. When others make mistakes, they blame character. This creates a powerful imbalance in judgment. This phenomenon influences relationships, workplaces, friendships, social conflicts, and everyday interactions. It shapes first impressions and often fuels misunderstandings that could have been avoided. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals can exploit it by directing attention towards someone's actions while concealing the circumstances behind them. The truly eerie aspect of the fundamental attribution error is that people often feel completely certain they understand another person's character based on a single moment. In reality, they may be judging an entire human being without ever seeing the invisible pressures, fears, struggles, and circumstances that were shaping that behavior behind the scenes. The actor-observer bias. The actor-observer bias is one of the most fascinating and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals that people often explain the exact same behavior in completely different ways depending on whether they are judging themselves or someone else. Most individuals believe they evaluate actions fairly and objectively. However, this bias shows that the mind frequently applies one set of rules to its own behavior and an entirely different set to the behavior of others. At its core, the actor-observer bias occurs when people attribute their own actions to circumstances while attributing other people's actions to their personality or character. If a person arrives late to a meeting, they may blame traffic, stress, or an unexpected problem. If someone else arrives late, they may assume that person is careless, irresponsible, or disrespectful. The behavior is the same, but the explanation changes depending on who performed it. The reason this phenomenon works lies in perspective. When evaluating our own actions, we have access to our thoughts, emotions, intentions, and circumstances. We know the pressures we faced and the reasons behind our choices. When observing others, however, we only see the behavior itself. The invisible context remains hidden, making personality seem like the most obvious explanation. What makes the actor-observer bias particularly disturbing is how naturally it occurs. People often fail to notice the double standard because both explanations feel reasonable from their respective perspectives. The bias quietly shapes judgments without drawing attention to itself. This phenomenon influences relationships, workplace conflicts, friendships, family dynamics, and everyday misunderstandings. It often causes people to be more forgiving of their own mistakes while being harsher toward the mistakes of others. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals may exploit this tendency by encouraging others to focus on behavior while hiding important contextual details. The truly eerie aspect of the actor-observer bias is that people often believe they are seeing situations clearly and fairly, when in reality, their perspective may be creating a distorted version of events. Without realizing it, they may judge others for actions they would have excused in themselves, allowing hidden biases to quietly shape their view of the world and the people around them. The in-group bias. The in-group bias is one of the most fascinating and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how quickly people can favor those they see as part of their own group. Most individuals believe they judge others based on character, behavior, and personal qualities. However, the human mind often operates differently. The moment someone is perceived as belonging to the same group, team, community, belief system, or identity, they may receive trust, support, and forgiveness that outsiders never receive. At its core, the in-group bias occurs when people show preference toward members of their own group while viewing outsiders less favorably. These groups can be based on nationality, religion, profession, political beliefs, hobbies, schools, sports teams, or even completely random categories. Once a sense of us is established, attitudes and decisions often begin changing in subtle ways. The reason this phenomenon exists lies deep within human evolution. For thousands of years, survival depended on belonging to a group. Cooperation with trusted members increased safety, access to resources, and protection from threats. As a result, the brain developed a tendency to view members of the group more positively and to approach outsiders with greater caution. What makes the in-group bias particularly disturbing is how little evidence is needed to trigger it. People can form strong preferences for those who share even the smallest similarities. Once that sense of connection appears, flaws may be overlooked, mistakes may be forgiven, and positive qualities may be exaggerated. This phenomenon influences friendships, workplaces, politics, social movements, organizations, and everyday interactions. It shapes who receives trust, opportunities, and support, often without conscious awareness. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative leaders and groups frequently exploit the human desire for belonging by creating strong divisions between us and them. The truly eerie aspect of the in-group bias is that people often believe they are being fair and objective, never realizing that a simple feeling of shared identity may be quietly influencing their judgments. Without noticing it, they can begin treating people differently not because of who they are, but because of the group they happen to belong to. The outgroup homogeneity effect. The outgroup homogeneity effect is one of the most fascinating and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how easily the human mind oversimplifies people who are perceived as outsiders. Most individuals believe they see others as unique individuals with their own personalities, experiences, and beliefs. However, when it comes to people outside their own group, the brain often takes a shortcut. Instead of recognizing individual differences, it begins viewing members of the outside group as largely the same. At its core, the outgroup homogeneity effect occurs when people perceive members of their own group as diverse and unique, while viewing members of other groups as more similar to one another than they actually are. Within their own group, people notice different personalities, opinions, strengths, weaknesses, and life stories. Outside the group, those distinctions become blurred, creating the illusion that everyone is essentially alike. The reason this phenomenon exists lies in familiarity and exposure. People spend more time interacting with members of their own group, giving them access to individual stories and personal details. Outsiders are often encountered less frequently, so the mind relies on broad categories and general impressions instead. The lack of detailed knowledge encourages oversimplification. What makes the outgroup homogeneity effect particularly disturbing is how naturally it develops. People rarely realize they are doing it. They may genuinely believe they are making accurate observations while unknowingly reducing complex individuals into simplified stereotypes. The bias creates a false sense of understanding where very little understanding actually exists. This phenomenon influences social relationships, politics, workplaces, cultural interactions, and group conflicts. It can contribute to misunderstandings, prejudice, and unnecessary divisions between people. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals and organizations often strengthen group loyalty by portraying outsiders as a single uniform group rather than as individuals with diverse perspectives and experiences. The truly eerie aspect of the outgroup homogeneity effect is that people often feel certain they understand those outside their group, when in reality, they may be seeing only a simplified image created by their own minds. Without realizing it, they replace complexity with assumption and individuality with a stereotype that never fully reflects reality. The Groupthink Effect. The groupthink effect is one of the most fascinating and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how intelligent people can make remarkably poor decisions when the desire for harmony becomes more important than the search for truth. Most individuals assume that bringing more people together leads to better thinking, better decisions, and fewer mistakes. However, the groupthink effect shows that groups can sometimes become less rational than the individuals within them. At its core, the groupthink effect occurs when members of a group prioritize agreement, unity, and social acceptance over critical thinking. Instead of openly questioning ideas, expressing doubts, or presenting alternative viewpoints, people begin suppressing concerns in order to maintain harmony. The group gradually moves toward consensus, not because everyone truly agrees, but because disagreement feels uncomfortable or risky. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the human need for belonging and acceptance. People naturally want to avoid conflict, rejection, and social tension. When surrounded by a confident majority, individuals may begin doubting their own judgment. Even when they notice flaws in a decision, they may remain silent to avoid standing out or disrupting the group's unity. What makes the groupthink effect particularly disturbing is how invisible it can be. Everyone may appear confident, supportive, and united, creating the illusion that the decision is strong. In reality, important questions may never be asked, warnings may be ignored, and critical information may remain unspoken. The appearance of agreement becomes mistaken for evidence of correctness. This phenomenon influences businesses, governments, organizations, friendships, families, and social groups. It can shape major decisions with significant consequences while giving participants the false impression that everything has been carefully considered. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative leaders often encourage environments where dissent is discouraged and conformity is rewarded. The truly eerie aspect of the groupthink effect is that people often believe they are part of a wise and unified group, never realizing that their silence may be helping to create the very mistakes they would have prevented if they had simply spoken up. In the pursuit of agreement, truth itself can quietly disappear. The Bystander Effect. The bystander effect is one of the most unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals a disturbing truth about human behavior. The more people who witness a problem, the less likely any one person may be to help. Most individuals believe they would step forward in an emergency, offer assistance to someone in need, or take action when something clearly seems wrong. However, the bystander effect shows that the presence of other people can unexpectedly reduce the likelihood of intervention. At its core, the bystander effect occurs when individuals become less likely to act because others are present. When someone is alone and sees a problem, responsibility feels personal and direct. But when many people are watching, responsibility becomes psychologically shared. Each person assumes someone else will take action, causing everyone to hesitate while waiting for someone else to move first. The reason this phenomenon works lies in a combination of social influence and uncertainty. In unfamiliar situations, people often look to others for cues about how to behave. If everyone appears calm or inactive, individuals may interpret the situation as less serious than it actually is. At the same time, the responsibility to act becomes diluted across the group, making personal action feel less necessary. What makes the bystander effect particularly disturbing is that it can affect ordinary, caring people. The failure to act is not always the result of cruelty or indifference. Often, it emerges from psychological processes that occur automatically and without awareness. This phenomenon influences emergencies, workplace situations, social settings, public spaces, and online communities. It helps explain why serious problems can sometimes remain unaddressed despite being witnessed by many people. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals may take advantage of crowded environments where responsibility is less clear and intervention is less likely. The truly eerie aspect of the bystander effect is that people often assume someone else will help, unaware that everyone around them may be thinking exactly the same thing. In those critical moments, a crowd can create the illusion of safety while silently increasing the risk that no one acts at all. The diffusion of responsibility. The diffusion of responsibility is one of the most unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how personal accountability can quietly disappear when other people are present. Most individuals believe they would take action when faced with an important problem, make difficult decisions when necessary, or step forward when someone needs help. However, this effect shows that the presence of other people can significantly reduce a person's sense of personal responsibility, often without them realizing it. At its core, the diffusion of responsibility occurs when individuals feel less responsible for taking action because they believe responsibility is shared among a group. When a person is alone, the burden of action falls entirely on them. But when multiple people are involved, the mind begins distributing that responsibility across everyone present. As a result, each individual feels less personal pressure to act. The reason this phenomenon works lies in human social psychology. People naturally assume that if a situation is important, someone else will notice it, address it, or take charge. This assumption creates a dangerous cycle. Each person expects another individual to act first, causing everyone to hesitate simultaneously. The larger the group, the more diluted personal responsibility often becomes. What makes the diffusion of responsibility particularly disturbing is that it can affect well-intentioned people. The failure to act is not necessarily caused by selfishness or lack of concern. Instead, the mind unconsciously shifts accountability away from itself and toward the collective group. This phenomenon influences workplaces, social settings, organizations, online communities, emergencies, and public situations. It can lead to delays, inaction, and situations where obvious problems remain unresolved despite being noticed by many people. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals may exploit environments where responsibility is unclear, knowing that people are less likely to intervene when they assume someone else will. The truly eerie aspect of the diffusion of responsibility is that people often walk away believing they were not personally responsible for what happened. In reality, everyone may have surrendered responsibility at the same moment, creating a situation where countless observers were present, yet no one felt accountable enough to act. The De-Individuation Effect. The De-Individuation Effect is one of the most fascinating and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how dramatically human behavior can change when a person feels anonymous within a group. Most individuals believe their actions are guided by personal values, self-control, and individual responsibility. However, under certain conditions, people can begin losing their sense of individual identity and become influenced by the emotions, behaviors, and expectations of the crowd around them. At its core, the de-individuation effect occurs when individuals feel less personally identifiable and therefore less personally accountable for their actions. In large groups, crowds, online communities, or situations where anonymity is increased, people may begin behaving in ways they would never consider when acting alone. The awareness of personal responsibility weakens while the influence of the group becomes stronger. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the relationship between self-awareness and accountability. When people feel visible and personally responsible, they tend to regulate their behavior according to social norms and personal values. When anonymity increases, self-awareness often decreases. The mind shifts attention away from personal identity and toward the collective identity of the group. What makes the de-individuation effect particularly disturbing is how quickly it can alter behavior. Ordinary individuals who are kind, responsible, and thoughtful when alone may engage in actions they later struggle to explain. Emotions spread rapidly through groups, and personal restraint can weaken as people begin feeling protected by anonymity. This phenomenon influences crowd behavior, social media interactions, online discussions, protests, organizations, and group dynamics. It demonstrates how strongly the social environment can shape individual actions. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative leaders and groups may intentionally create conditions that reduce personal accountability, making people more likely to conform to collective behavior. The truly eerie aspect of the de-individuation effect is that people often believe they are acting according to their own choices, when in reality, they may be losing touch with their individual identity. Without realizing it, they can become part of a psychological current that carries them toward actions they would never have chosen on their own. The emotional contagion effect. The emotional contagion effect is one of the most fascinating and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals that emotions can spread between people in ways that often occur without conscious awareness. Most individuals believe their feelings originate entirely from their own thoughts, experiences, and circumstances. However, the emotional contagion effect suggests that emotions can be transmitted from one person to another, quietly influencing moods, attitudes, and behaviors without anyone realizing it. At its core, the emotional contagion effect occurs when people unconsciously absorb and mirror the emotions of those around them. A cheerful person can brighten an entire room. An anxious individual can create tension among others. A single person's emotional state can gradually influence the feelings of a group, causing emotions to spread, much like a ripple moving through water. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the brain's natural tendency to mimic and synchronize with others. Human beings are highly social creatures who evolved to pay close attention to emotional signals. Facial expressions, tone of voice, body language, and behavior provide important information about the environment. As a result, people often unconsciously imitate the emotions they observe, causing those emotions to become their own. What makes the emotional contagion effect particularly disturbing is how invisible it can be. A person may wake up feeling calm and positive, only to spend time around someone who is fearful, angry, or stressed, and gradually adopt those emotions without understanding why. The emotional shift feels personal, even though it may have originated elsewhere. This phenomenon influences relationships, workplaces, families, social groups, online communities, and public events. It shapes the emotional atmosphere people experience every day. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals may deliberately display strong emotions to influence the feelings and reactions of others. Fear, outrage, panic, and excitement can spread rapidly when amplified by groups or media. The truly eerie aspect of the emotional contagion effect is that people often believe they are feeling their own emotions, never realizing that some of those feelings may have quietly entered their minds through the emotional energy of the people surrounding them. The Chameleon Effect. The Chameleon Effect is one of the most fascinating and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how people unconsciously imitate the behavior of those around them. Most individuals believe their gestures, mannerisms, posture, and speaking style are entirely their own. However, the Chameleon Effect suggests that people are constantly and often unknowingly adapting to the behavior of others in order to create social connection and acceptance. At its core, the Chameleon Effect occurs when individuals automatically mimic the body language, facial expressions, speech patterns, and behaviors of the people they interact with. This imitation is usually subtle and happens without conscious intention. A person may begin matching another's posture, adopting similar phrases, mirroring facial expressions, or adjusting their tone of voice without realizing they are doing so. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the human need for social bonding. Throughout history, cooperation and group membership played a critical role in survival. As a result, the brain evolved mechanisms that help people connect with one another. Mimicry creates a sense of familiarity and similarity, which often increases trust, comfort, and rapport. When people behave similarly, they tend to feel more connected. What makes the Chameleon Effect particularly unsettling is how invisible it can be. Individuals often believe they are acting naturally when their behavior is actually being influenced by those around them. The adaptation feels authentic because it occurs automatically beneath conscious awareness. This phenomenon influences friendships, romantic relationships, negotiations, workplaces, social groups, and everyday conversations. It helps explain why people often begin resembling those they spend the most time with, not only in behavior, but sometimes in attitudes and beliefs as well. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals may intentionally use mimicry to accelerate trust and create a false sense of connection. By subtly reflecting someone's behavior, they can appear more relatable and trustworthy than they truly are. The truly eerie aspect of the Chameleon Effect is that people often assume their behavior reflects only their own personality. In reality, they may be unconsciously absorbing and reflecting the habits, expressions, and emotional signals of those around them, allowing other people to quietly shape their actions without ever saying a word. The Mimicry Effect. The Mimicry Effect is one of the most fascinating and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how easily human beings can be influenced through simple imitation. Most people believe trust, connection, and rapport develop through meaningful conversations and shared experiences. While those factors certainly matter, the mimicry effect shows that something much more subtle can shape relationships beneath conscious awareness. A slight reflection of another person's behavior can create a powerful sense of familiarity and connection. At its core, the mimicry effect occurs when one person copies another person's gestures, posture, expressions, speech patterns, or behaviors. This imitation is often so subtle that it goes unnoticed. A person may unknowingly adopt a similar sitting position, match the pace of another person's speech, or use the same type of expressions during conversation. These small similarities can create an unexpected feeling of comfort between individuals. The reason this phenomenon works lies deep within human social psychology. People naturally feel more comfortable around those who seem similar to them. When someone mirrors aspects of their behavior, the brain often interprets that similarity as a sign of understanding, trustworthiness, and social connection. The imitation creates a feeling of alignment that can strengthen relationships without either person consciously recognizing why. What makes the mimicry effect particularly disturbing is how automatic it can be. People may begin trusting, liking, or cooperating with someone simply because subtle behavioral similarities make the interaction feel more natural. The emotional response often occurs before any conscious evaluation takes place. This phenomenon influences friendships, dating, negotiations, leadership, sales, and everyday social interactions. It quietly shapes first impressions and interpersonal dynamics. There is also a darker side to this effect. Skilled manipulators, con artists, and persuasive individuals often use deliberate mimicry to create a false sense of closeness and trust. The truly eerie aspect of the mimicry effect is that people often believe a connection is developing because of genuine compatibility, never realizing that a carefully mirrored gesture, expression, or tone of voice may be quietly guiding their feelings and lowering their defenses without their awareness. The love bombing effect. The love bombing effect is one of the most powerful and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how overwhelming affection can sometimes be used as a tool of influence rather than genuine connection. Most people naturally associate intense attention, compliments, and affection with love, admiration, and emotional closeness. However, love bombing demonstrates that excessive displays of care can occasionally serve a very different purpose, creating rapid emotional attachment and dependency. At its core, the love bombing effect occurs when a person is flooded with attention, praise, affection, gifts, or validation in a way that feels extraordinary and almost too good to be true. The recipient may feel deeply appreciated, understood, and valued. The intensity of the experience can create a powerful emotional high, making the relationship feel unique and unusually meaningful in a very short period of time. The reason this phenomenon works lies in basic human emotional needs. People naturally crave acceptance, appreciation, and connection. When these needs are met in an intense and consistent way, the brain often responds with strong feelings of attachment and trust. The emotional rewards can become so powerful that critical thinking begins to weaken, making it easier to overlook warning signs or inconsistencies. What makes the love bombing effect particularly disturbing is how quickly it can influence perception. The constant validation creates an emotional environment where the recipient begins associating the other person with happiness, security, and self-worth. The connection can feel profound even when it is still very new. This phenomenon can appear in romantic relationships, friendships, social groups, organizations, and recruitment efforts. Not every intense display of affection is manipulative, but the psychological effect remains powerful regardless of intent. There is also a darker side to this phenomenon. Manipulative individuals may use excessive affection strategically to gain trust, loyalty, or control before gradually changing their behavior later. The truly eerie aspect of the love bombing effect is that people often believe they are falling in love with a person, when in reality, they may be becoming attached to a carefully constructed emotional experience designed to make resistance feel impossible and separation feel unbearable. The future faking effect. The future faking effect is one of the most unsettling psychological manipulation tactics because it reveals how easily hope can be used to influence human behavior. Most people are naturally drawn toward promises of a better future. They are motivated by dreams, plans, and the possibility that something meaningful lies ahead. However, future faking occurs when someone uses those hopes and expectations not to build a genuine future, but to gain trust, compliance, or emotional investment in the present. At its core, the future faking effect occurs when a person makes exciting promises about future plans, commitments, rewards, or life changes that they have little intention of fulfilling. The promises may sound sincere and convincing. They often involve things the other person deeply desires, such as love, commitment, success, opportunities, or shared goals. The future becomes a powerful tool for maintaining influence in the present. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the emotional power of anticipation. Human beings are strongly motivated by what they believe is coming next. The expectation of future happiness can create excitement, attachment, and optimism. Once people become emotionally invested in the promised future, they may tolerate disappointments, overlook warning signs, or continue waiting for the fulfillment of those promises. What makes the future faking effect particularly disturbing is that the future never arrives in the way it was described. Whenever doubts begin to emerge, new promises often replace old ones. The vision remains just close enough to feel possible, but never close enough to become reality. Hope becomes the mechanism that keeps the cycle alive. This phenomenon can appear in relationships, workplaces, business dealings, leadership situations, and social influence. It thrives wherever promises carry emotional value. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals often understand that controlling someone's hopes can be more effective than controlling their fears. The truly eerie aspect of the future faking effect is that people often believe they are staying because of what already exists, when in reality, they may be staying because of a future that only exists in words. Without realizing it, they become emotionally attached not to reality, but to a promise that continuously moves further away each time they try to reach it. The intermittent reinforcement effect. The intermittent reinforcement effect is one of the most powerful and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals why people often become most attached to situations that provide rewards unpredictably. Most individuals assume that consistent rewards create the strongest habits and emotional bonds. Surprisingly, psychology suggests that unpredictable rewards can be even more powerful. When positive experiences arrive inconsistently, they often become far more difficult to resist or walk away from. At its core, the intermittent reinforcement effect occurs when rewards are given occasionally rather than consistently. A person does not know when the next reward will arrive, which creates a state of anticipation and uncertainty. Because the reward is unpredictable, attention remains focused on the possibility that the next positive outcome could happen at any moment. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the brain's response to uncertainty. Predictable rewards become expected over time, reducing their emotional impact. Unpredictable rewards, however, keep the brain engaged. Each positive experience feels more significant because it arrives unexpectedly. The uncertainty itself becomes part of the attraction, encouraging people to keep investing time, energy, and attention. What makes the intermittent reinforcement effect particularly disturbing is how deeply it can influence behavior. People may remain committed to situations that provide only occasional rewards because those rare positive moments feel especially meaningful. The inconsistency creates a powerful cycle of hope and anticipation that can be difficult to break. This phenomenon influences relationships, social media, gaming, workplace dynamics, consumer behavior, and many forms of human attachment. It helps explain why some of the strongest emotional bonds develop in situations that are also the most unpredictable. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals may intentionally alternate between attention and distance, praise and criticism, or affection and withdrawal to strengthen emotional dependence. The truly eerie aspect of the intermittent reinforcement effect is that people often believe they are chasing happiness, when in reality, they may be chasing uncertainty. The occasional reward becomes so emotionally powerful that it keeps them invested, even when long periods of disappointment far outweigh the moments of satisfaction. The trauma bonding effect. The trauma bonding effect is one of the most disturbing psychological phenomena because it reveals how strong emotional attachments can sometimes form in situations that involve repeated emotional pain, fear, or distress. Most people assume that harmful experiences naturally push individuals away from those who cause them. However, trauma bonding shows that under certain conditions, the opposite can occur. The very experiences that should encourage separation can sometimes strengthen emotional attachment instead. At its core, the trauma bonding effect occurs when a powerful emotional connection develops through a cycle of negative experiences, followed by moments of relief, affection, validation, or kindness. The contrast between emotional pain and emotional comfort creates an intense psychological dynamic. The positive moments often feel especially meaningful because they arrive after periods of distress, making them appear more valuable than they might otherwise seem. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the brain's response to emotional highs and lows. When periods of stress are interrupted by moments of comfort, the relief itself can feel deeply rewarding. Over time, the person may begin associating the source of both the distress and the relief with emotional significance. The relationship becomes emotionally intense, making it difficult to view the situation objectively. What makes the trauma bonding effect particularly unsettling is how confusing it can feel to those experiencing it. People may genuinely care about someone who repeatedly causes them pain. They may remember the moments of kindness more vividly than the moments of suffering, creating hope that the positive version of the person will eventually return permanently. This phenomenon can influence relationships, families, social groups, organizations, and other emotionally intense environments. It often develops gradually and without conscious awareness. There is also a darker side to this effect. Some manipulative individuals may create cycles of emotional distress and relief that strengthen attachment over time. The truly eerie aspect of the trauma bonding effect is that people often believe they are staying because of love, loyalty, or hope, never realizing that the emotional bond itself may have been shaped by a cycle of pain and relief that makes leaving feel far more difficult than logic alone would suggest. The gaslighting effect. The gaslighting effect is one of the most disturbing psychological manipulation tactics because it targets something fundamental to human existence, a person's trust in their own perception of reality. Most individuals rely on their memories, observations, and experiences to navigate the world. However, gaslighting is designed to slowly undermine that trust, creating confusion, self-doubt, and dependence on another person's version of events. At its core, the gaslighting effect occurs when someone repeatedly causes another person to question their memories, perceptions, or understanding of reality. The manipulator may deny events that clearly happened, rewrite past conversations, dismiss legitimate concerns, or insist that the other person is overreacting, confused, or imagining things. Over time, these repeated distortions can make the target increasingly uncertain about what is true. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the human need for certainty and validation. People naturally seek consistency between their experiences and the feedback they receive from others. When someone persistently challenges their perception of reality, especially someone they trust, the resulting confusion can become overwhelming. To reduce that uncertainty, individuals may begin relying more heavily on the manipulator's version of events than on their own judgment. What makes the gaslighting effect particularly unsettling is how gradual it often is. The manipulation rarely begins with obvious lies. Instead, it develops through small distortions, subtle denials, and repeated contradictions that slowly erode confidence. By the time the pattern becomes visible, self-doubt may already be deeply rooted. This phenomenon can influence relationships, families, workplaces, social groups, and other environments where trust exists. It affects perception, confidence, memory, and emotional well-being. There is also a darker side to this effect. Gaslighting can become a powerful tool for control because people who no longer trust their own judgment become more vulnerable to influence. The truly eerie aspect of the gaslighting effect is that the victim often begins questioning themselves rather than the manipulation. Without realizing it, they may slowly surrender confidence in their own reality and start seeing the world through the eyes of the person who is distorting it. The silent treatment effect. The silent treatment effect is one of the most emotionally unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how the absence of communication can sometimes be more powerful than words themselves. Most people think of conflict as arguments, criticism, or confrontation. However, silence can carry its own form of influence. When communication is suddenly withdrawn, the emotional impact can be surprisingly intense, creating confusion, anxiety, and a desperate search for answers. At its core, the silent treatment effect occurs when one person deliberately stops communicating with another. Messages go unanswered, conversations are avoided, and emotional connection is withheld. The silence creates uncertainty because the other person is left without clear information about what is happening, why it is happening, or when it will end. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the human need for social connection and belonging. Human beings are deeply social creatures. Acceptance, acknowledgement, and communication provide a sense of security. When those things are suddenly removed, the brain often interprets the situation as a threat. Feelings of rejection, exclusion, and self-doubt can quickly emerge, making the silence emotionally difficult to ignore. What makes the silent treatment effect particularly disturbing is that the silence often forces the other person to fill in the missing information themselves. They may replay conversations, search for mistakes, and question their own behavior. The lack of explanation allows the imagination to create possibilities that are often worse than reality. This phenomenon influences relationships, friendships, families, workplaces, and social groups. It can occur during conflicts, misunderstandings, or periods of emotional withdrawal. There is also a darker side to this effect. Some individuals use silence strategically as a means of punishment, control, or emotional manipulation. By withholding communication, they create discomfort that pressures the other person to seek reconciliation on their terms. The truly eerie aspect of the silent treatment effect is that nothing is being said, yet the silence itself communicates something powerful. Without a single word, it can trigger fear, uncertainty, guilt, and emotional distress, causing people to question themselves while desperately searching for a response that never comes. The Triangulation Effect. The triangulation effect is one of the most unsettling psychological manipulation tactics because it introduces a third person into a relationship or interaction in order to create tension, competition, insecurity, or control. Most people assume that conflicts and relationships exist between two individuals. However, triangulation changes the dynamic by inserting another person into the emotional equation, often in a way that quietly shifts power and influence. At its core, the triangulation effect occurs when one person uses a third party to influence, pressure, compare, or manipulate someone else. Instead of communicating directly, the manipulator may constantly mention another person's opinions, achievements, approval, or attention. The third person becomes a psychological tool that affects the target's emotions and behavior. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the human desire for acceptance, belonging, and validation. When people feel they are being compared to someone else or competing for attention, they often become more emotionally invested. Feelings of jealousy, insecurity, fear of rejection, or the need to prove oneself can begin influencing decisions. The focus shifts away from the actual relationship and toward the perceived competition. What makes the triangulation effect particularly disturbing is that the third person may not even realize they are being used. Sometimes the individual being referenced is completely unaware that their name, success, attention, or relationship is being leveraged to influence someone else. The psychological impact occurs regardless of whether the third party actively participates. This phenomenon appears in friendships, romantic relationships, families, workplaces, and social groups. It can create confusion, rivalry, mistrust, and emotional instability, often while the manipulator remains in a position of influence. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals frequently use triangulation to maintain control, create dependency, or keep others competing for approval and attention. The truly eerie aspect of the triangulation effect is that people often believe they are reacting to a genuine rivalry or threat, never realizing that the competition itself may have been carefully manufactured. Without noticing it, they can become trapped in an emotional game where the real source of influence is not the third person, but the individual who introduced them into the equation in the first place. The projection effect. The projection effect is one of the most fascinating and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how easily people can mistake their own thoughts, feelings, and motives for those of others. Most individuals believe they see other people as they truly are. However, the projection effect suggests that people often view others through the lens of their own emotions, assumptions, and inner experiences, unknowingly attributing parts of themselves to the people around them. At its core, the projection effect occurs when individuals assume that others think, feel, or behave similarly to themselves. A person who is honest may expect honesty from everyone else. Someone who is distrustful may constantly suspect hidden motives in others. People often use their own thoughts and emotions as a reference point when trying to understand the behavior of those around them. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the limits of human perception. People have direct access to their own thoughts, feelings, fears, and desires, but they cannot directly access the minds of others. Faced with this uncertainty, the brain often fills in the gaps by using personal experience as a guide. The result is an assumption that others are more similar to us than they may actually be. What makes the projection effect particularly disturbing is how invisible it can be. Individuals often feel completely certain that they are accurately reading another person's intentions when they may actually be seeing reflections of their own emotions. The projection feels real because it originates from genuine feelings within the observer. This phenomenon influences relationships, friendships, workplaces, negotiations, and everyday social interactions. It shapes expectations and interpretations, often creating misunderstandings that seem difficult to explain. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals may accuse others of behaviors or motives that actually reflect their own intentions, making projection a powerful tool for deflecting attention and avoiding accountability. The truly eerie aspect of the projection effect is that people often believe they are discovering hidden truths about others, when in reality, they may be uncovering hidden truths about themselves. Without realizing it, they can spend years reacting not to who other people truly are, but to reflections of their own inner world projected outward onto everyone they meet. The projection bias. The projection bias is one of the most fascinating and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how strongly people assume their current thoughts, emotions, and desires will remain the same in the future. Most individuals believe they can accurately predict what they will want, need, or value later in life. However, the projection bias suggests that people often overestimate the stability of their present mindset, assuming that their future self will think and feel much like they do right now. At its core, the projection bias occurs when individuals use their current emotional state as a blueprint for future decisions. A person who feels excited today may believe that excitement will last indefinitely. Someone who is angry may assume their anger will remain justified tomorrow. People often make long-term decisions based on temporary emotions without realizing how dramatically their perspective may change over time. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the brain's difficulty imagining different mental states. Human beings experience the present moment with incredible intensity. Current emotions feel real, immediate, and important. Because those feelings dominate awareness, it becomes difficult to accurately picture how future circumstances might alter desires, priorities, and judgments. What makes the projection bias particularly disturbing is how confidently people make decisions under its influence. They often feel certain that their future self will appreciate the choices they are making today. Yet once emotions change, those same decisions may no longer seem reasonable. The future version of themselves may value entirely different things. This phenomenon influences relationships, financial decisions, career choices, purchases, lifestyle commitments, and personal goals. It shapes many of the long-term decisions people make throughout life. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals may take advantage of strong emotions in the present, knowing that people are more likely to make commitments they may later regret. The truly eerie aspect of the projection bias is that people often believe they understand their future selves better than they actually do. Without realizing it, they may be allowing a temporary emotion, desire, or fear to make decisions for a person they have not yet become, creating consequences that remain long after the feeling that inspired them has disappeared. The splitting effect. The splitting effect is one of the most fascinating and unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how the human mind can simplify complex people and situations into extreme categories. Most individuals believe they evaluate others with nuance and balance. However, under emotional pressure, the mind often abandons complexity and begins viewing people as either completely good or completely bad, trustworthy or untrustworthy, admirable or worthless. The gray areas disappear, leaving only extremes. At its core, the splitting effect occurs when individuals divide people, experiences, or ideas into all or nothing categories. A person who was once viewed as wonderful may suddenly be seen as terrible after a disappointment. Someone admired one day may be completely rejected the next. Instead of holding both positive and negative qualities in mind at the same time, the brain focuses on one side while ignoring the other. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the mind's desire for emotional certainty. Human beings often find ambiguity uncomfortable. It is easier to categorize someone as entirely good or entirely bad than to accept that most people possess both strengths and flaws. During periods of strong emotion, this tendency becomes even more powerful because extreme judgments feel simpler and more emotionally satisfying. What makes the splitting effect particularly disturbing is how quickly perception can change. The person being judged may not have changed significantly at all. Instead, the observer's emotional state alters how the individual is perceived. The same person can become a hero or a villain depending on which qualities are receiving attention at that moment. This phenomenon influences relationships, friendships, workplaces, politics, social groups, and personal identity. It often contributes to conflict, disappointment, and unstable perceptions of others. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals may encourage extreme thinking by portraying people as entirely good or entirely bad in order to gain loyalty or create division. The truly eerie aspect of the splitting effect is that people often feel absolutely certain about their judgments while experiencing it. In reality, they may be seeing only half of the picture, allowing emotion to erase complexity and transform a multidimensional human being into a simplified image that exists primarily inside their own mind. The Idealization-Devaluation Cycle. The Idealization-Devaluation Cycle is one of the most unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how quickly admiration can transform into disappointment when unrealistic expectations collide with reality. Most people assume that feelings toward others change gradually over time. However, this cycle shows that some relationships can swing dramatically between emotional extremes, creating intense attachment followed by equally intense disillusionment. At its core, the idealization-devaluation cycle begins when a person places someone else on a pedestal. During the idealization phase, the other individual is viewed as exceptional, flawless, or uniquely special. Their strengths are magnified, their imperfections are overlooked, and they seem capable of fulfilling emotional needs in a way no one else can. The connection feels exciting, powerful, and deeply meaningful. The reason this phenomenon develops lies in the human desire for certainty, admiration, and emotional fulfillment. When people strongly desire connection, they may unconsciously project hopes, fantasies, and expectations onto another person. Instead of seeing who the person truly is, they begin seeing who they want them to be. The idealized image becomes more powerful than reality itself. What makes the idealization-devaluation cycle particularly disturbing is what happens next. Because no human being can consistently live up to perfection, disappointment eventually emerges. Small flaws that were once ignored suddenly become impossible to overlook. Admiration may transform into frustration, resentment, or emotional distance. The same person who was once viewed as extraordinary may now seem deeply flawed. This phenomenon influences romantic relationships, friendships, leadership dynamics, workplaces, and social groups. It often creates emotional instability because perceptions shift between extremes rather than remaining balanced. There is also a darker side to this effect. Manipulative individuals may encourage idealization by presenting an unrealistically perfect image, knowing that strong emotional attachment often follows. The truly eerie aspect of the idealization-devaluation cycle is that people often believe they are responding to dramatic changes in someone else, when in reality, the greatest change may have occurred in their own perception. The person remains largely the same, while the image built around them rises and collapses inside the observer's mind. The Hoovering Effect. The Hoovering Effect is one of the most unsettling psychological manipulation tactics because it reveals how difficult it can be to truly escape certain relationships or forms of influence. Most people assume that once a connection ends, both individuals gradually move on with their lives. However, the Hoovering Effect occurs when someone repeatedly attempts to pull another person back into a relationship, interaction, or emotional dynamic after distance has been created. At its core, the Hoovering Effect involves efforts to re-establish contact after a separation, disagreement, or period of no communication. The person initiating the contact may suddenly become affectionate, apologetic, nostalgic, concerned, or unusually attentive. They often present themselves in a way that triggers old emotions and memories, making the previous connection feel difficult to resist. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the power of emotional attachment and unresolved feelings. Human beings naturally remember meaningful experiences, especially those connected to strong emotions. When someone reappears and reminds another person of happier moments, hopes, or unfinished emotional business, those memories can quickly resurface. The emotional bond may feel alive again, even if significant problems existed in the past. What makes the Hoovering Effect particularly disturbing is that the renewed attention often appears exactly when the other person is beginning to heal, recover, or move forward. The timing can create confusion, reopening emotional wounds that seem to be closing. Old feelings become mixed with new uncertainty. This phenomenon can occur in romantic relationships, friendships, family dynamics, workplaces, and other emotionally significant connections. It often relies on familiarity, nostalgia, and emotional vulnerability. There is also a darker side to this effect. Some manipulative individuals use renewed attention not because they have genuinely changed, but because they wish to regain influence, validation, or control. The truly eerie aspect of the Hoovering Effect is that people often believe they are reconnecting with someone from their past, when in reality, they may be reconnecting with the emotions attached to that person. Without realizing it, they can find themselves drawn back into patterns they thought they had already escaped, pulled in by memories that feel stronger than logic. The Flying Monkey Effect. The Flying Monkey Effect is one of the most unsettling psychological manipulation tactics because it reveals how influence can be exercised indirectly through other people. Most individuals expect conflict, persuasion, or pressure to come directly from the person involved. However, the flying monkey effect occurs when third parties are recruited, intentionally or unintentionally, to carry out another person's agenda. Instead of confronting someone directly, the manipulator uses others as messengers, defenders, spies, or sources of pressure. The term comes from the flying monkeys in the classic story The Wizard of Oz, who carried out the orders of a more powerful figure. In psychology, the concept describes situations where individuals become extensions of someone else's influence, often without fully understanding the role they are playing. At its core, the flying monkey effect occurs when one person enlists others to influence, monitor, criticize, persuade, or pressure a target. Friends, family members, co-workers, or acquaintances may be drawn into the situation and encouraged to take sides. Sometimes they genuinely believe they are helping. Other times, they may not realize they are acting on incomplete or distorted information. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the power of social pressure. Human beings are highly sensitive to approval, belonging, and group acceptance. When criticism, persuasion, or influence comes from multiple people instead of one, it often feels more credible and difficult to resist. The target may begin questioning their own perspective simply because so many voices appear to be saying the same thing. What makes the flying monkey effect particularly disturbing is that the people carrying out the influence may not see themselves as participants in manipulation. They often believe they are acting independently, unaware that their actions are serving someone else's objectives. This phenomenon can appear in relationships, families, workplaces, social groups, and community dynamics. It thrives wherever communication flows through networks of people. The truly eerie aspect of the flying monkey effect is that a person may feel surrounded by opposition without realizing that many of those voices originated from a single source. What appears to be widespread agreement may actually be the echo of one individual's influence spreading through others and returning with far greater force. The Breadcrumbing Effect. The breadcrumbing effect is one of the most unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how small amounts of attention can keep people emotionally invested far longer than they should be. Most individuals assume that strong relationships are built on consistent communication, mutual effort, and genuine commitment. However, breadcrumbing works differently. Instead of providing meaningful connection, it offers just enough attention to keep hope alive while avoiding real investment. At its core, the breadcrumbing effect occurs when someone gives occasional signs of interest, affection, validation, or attention without any intention of developing a deeper connection. The messages may be brief, inconsistent, and unpredictable. A compliment appears after a long silence. A message arrives just as interest begins fading. A small gesture creates the impression that something meaningful might happen, even though nothing substantial ever develops. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the powerful relationship between hope and uncertainty. Human beings are naturally drawn toward possibilities. When attention is given unpredictably, the mind begins focusing on what could happen rather than what is actually happening. Each small interaction feels significant because it suggests that greater connection may be just around the corner. What makes the breadcrumbing effect particularly disturbing is that the attention often feels genuine in the moment. The recipient may interpret the occasional messages as evidence of interest, care, or future commitment. Because the positive signals are scattered and inconsistent, they become emotionally amplified. The rare moments of attention can overshadow long periods of neglect. This phenomenon appears in relationships, friendships, social interactions, professional environments, and online communication. It thrives where uncertainty exists and expectations remain unclear. There is also a darker side to this effect. Some individuals intentionally provide small amounts of attention to maintain influence, validation, or emotional control without offering genuine commitment. The truly eerie aspect of the breadcrumbing effect is that people often believe they are holding on to a connection, when in reality they may be holding on to a possibility. Without realizing it, they become emotionally attached not to what is consistently present, but to the hope created by occasional moments that suggest something more is coming, even when it never truly arrives. The orbiting effect. The orbiting effect is one of the most unsettling psychological phenomena because it creates a strange form of presence without connection. Most people assume that when someone leaves a relationship, friendship, or meaningful interaction, they either remain involved or disappear completely. However, the orbiting effect exists in the uncomfortable space between those two extremes. A person may stop communicating directly while continuing to remain visible in subtle ways, creating confusion and emotional uncertainty. At its core, the orbiting effect occurs when someone withdraws from direct interaction but continues observing, reacting, or maintaining a distant presence. They may stop conversations, avoid meaningful communication, or disappear from active involvement, yet still view updates, engage indirectly, or remain visible enough to remind the other person that they are still there. The connection is not maintained, but it is never fully severed either. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the human need for closure and certainty. When a relationship clearly ends, the mind can gradually process the loss and move forward. Orbiting interrupts that process. The continued presence creates mixed signals that keep questions alive. If the person is still watching, still appearing, or still showing signs of awareness, it becomes difficult to determine what their intentions truly are. What makes the orbiting effect particularly disturbing is the uncertainty it creates. The occasional signs of presence can trigger hope, curiosity, confusion, or self-doubt. People often begin searching for hidden meanings in small actions, wondering whether the connection still exists beneath the silence. This phenomenon influences relationships, friendships, social media interactions, and modern communication patterns. It often thrives in environments where visibility is easy, but meaningful communication is optional. There is also a darker side to this effect. Some individuals maintain a distant presence intentionally because it allows them to remain emotionally relevant without offering commitment, clarity, or accountability. The truly eerie aspect of the orbiting effect is that someone can remain psychologically present long after they have become emotionally absent. Without saying a word, they continue appearing at the edge of another person's awareness, creating a lingering sense that the story is not over even when no real relationship remains. The Stonewalling Effect. The Stonewalling Effect is one of the most unsettling psychological phenomena because it reveals how complete emotional withdrawal can become a powerful form of influence. Most people think of conflict as arguments, raised voices, or open disagreement. However, stonewalling works through the opposite approach. Instead of engaging in conflict, one person shuts down communication entirely, creating a wall that blocks discussion, understanding, and resolution. At its core, the stonewalling effect occurs when an individual refuses to participate in meaningful communication during a conflict or emotionally important situation. They may ignore questions, avoid eye contact, provide minimal responses, change the subject, or simply withdraw completely. Unlike a temporary need for space, stonewalling creates a pattern where genuine communication becomes impossible. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the human need for connection and resolution. When people experience conflict, they naturally seek understanding, clarification, or closure. Stonewalling denies all three. The lack of response creates uncertainty, causing the other person to become increasingly focused on restoring communication. The silence often feels more distressing than direct disagreement because there is nothing concrete to respond to. What makes the stonewalling effect particularly disturbing is how powerless it can make someone feel. Without communication, there is no opportunity to explain, repair, or understand. The person on the receiving end may begin questioning themselves, replaying conversations, and searching for answers that never arrive. This phenomenon influences romantic relationships, friendships, families, workplaces, and social interactions. It often creates emotional distance and unresolved tension that can continue long after the original issue occurred. There is also a darker side to this effect. Some individuals use stonewalling strategically to gain control, avoid accountability, or force others into a position of emotional pursuit. The truly eerie aspect of the stonewalling effect is that nothing dramatic appears to be happening on the surface. No harsh words are spoken, and no obvious confrontation occurs. Yet, behind the silence, emotional pressure quietly builds, leaving one person trapped in a conversation that can never move forward because the other person has chosen not to participate at all. The emotional blackmail effect. The emotional blackmail effect is one of the most unsettling psychological manipulation tactics because it uses a person's emotions against them. Most people expect influence to come through logic, persuasion, or direct requests. Emotional blackmail operates differently. Instead of appealing to reason, it targets feelings such as guilt, fear, obligation, loyalty, and responsibility, making people feel pressured to act against their own interests in order to avoid emotional consequences. At its core, the emotional blackmail effect occurs when someone uses emotional pressure to control another person's decisions or behavior. The manipulator may imply that refusal will lead to disappointment, rejection, conflict, suffering, or the loss of the relationship. Sometimes the threats are obvious, but often they are subtle. The message is not always spoken directly. Instead, it is communicated through guilt, disappointment, withdrawal, or emotional reactions that make the other person feel responsible. The reason this phenomenon works lies in the human need for connection and acceptance. Most people do not want to hurt others, create conflict, or be seen as selfish. When someone links compliance to emotional harmony, the pressure can become difficult to resist. The person begins focusing less on what they truly want and more on how to avoid the emotional discomfort being created. What makes the emotional blackmail effect particularly disturbing is that it often disguises itself as love, concern, sacrifice, or loyalty. The manipulation becomes difficult to recognize because it appears wrapped in emotions that seem familiar and meaningful. The target may genuinely believe they are acting out of kindness when they are actually responding to pressure. This phenomenon influences relationships, families, friendships, workplaces, and social groups. It can quietly shape decisions without obvious force or confrontation. The truly eerie aspect of the emotional blackmail effect is that people often feel they are making a free choice when they comply. In reality, the choice may have been carefully engineered through fear, guilt, or obligation. Without realizing it, they begin surrendering their own needs and boundaries, not because they truly agree, but because the emotional cost of saying no has been made to feel unbearably high.